Okay, well, now that we've established a lot of important things about how to pronounce it, the context for history and grammar and everything else, it's time to start dismantling some of the heretical and blasphemous claims of the internet. And of course, the first one on that, they get crazier and crazier, folks, so strap your seatbelt on. But the first one on that list is Yahweh a pagan god? We're going to dismantle that step by step, but a lot of people believe that Yahweh is a pagan god, a tribal god of some kind, or even worse, the devil. And we'll have a separate section for that because it requires a lot of defense, and people twist. It actually doesn't require that much defense, but you need to be prepared for all of the crazy twists and turns that these people take these arguments. Because of poor interpretation skills and historical half-truths and false teachers, people fall to the left or to the right very quickly. Remember what we covered in the very beginning of this presentation with Jesus being Yahweh? Remember what we covered about Jesus affirming the scriptures, the validity of the Old Testament? Remember Marcion, the heretic, and many people like him. And of course, as we go into this, keep your Fennec Fox ears open. Let's see here. This is from a site that needs to be zoomed out a little bit. Teeny tiny font. The Dark Cloud of Being. These are now samples of what I'm talking about. And this is, what is little known? Yahweh, God of lightning and the planet Saturn. What is little known is the biblical connection between God, the Father, and the 7 classical planets. Saturn and Jupiter in the Babylonian times were called the Great Twins, Jupiter being associated with the color white and Saturn with black. The former was the god of light, peacemaking, compassion, and order. The Romans identified him as this Jovian god with Jesus. Saturn, on the other hand, was a god of law and boundaries, a judge, these enforced by violent bouts of fire and lightning. Academic Mircea Eliade, which is a Romanian apparently, said that, because that name is definitely Romanian, says and look, here's an example. In English, if you read this, you would pronounce it Mercia. There's no way to pronounce it. In Romanian, the C is a ch, Mircea. And the I is I, Mircea. You don't even hear the E. Whereas in English, it'd be Mercia. So every language has its peculiarities. Mircea Eliade says that Hebrew Yahweh displayed his power by means of storms. Thunders in his voice. Lightning is called Yahweh's fire or his arrows. The fire and brimstone of Yahweh is indeed a lightning aspect. The Hebrew term barak, lightning, used in the sense of flashing arrowhead, attributed to the righteous anger of Yahweh. Similarly, the sword of God corresponds to flashing lightning. Yada yada. And so they have these things like with the menorah and how it's supposedly the 7 planets, and there's half-truths in here. Yes, God did have judgments with lightning and fire, and we even talked in my I forget which one video. I think it was the Masoretic video, but we talked about how when Jesus says, I saw Satan falling like lightning from heaven. It's Satan, yeah, there's a Satan series, because people think that has to do with the pre-angelic rebellion. No, pre-cosmic rebellion. It's not a pre-cosmic rebellion, folks. That is an idiom that is being used to make the Gentile audience understand that Satan, again, this is actually a good thing to talk about, because this is what we're going to be looking at in this section. It is the appropriation of pagan ideas, not belief systems, but pagan ideas, and showing them that God is actually the true God through those pagan ideas. Like, hey, you Greeks that that Zeus throws lightning bolts and you have all these myths about that. Well, in reality, that's God who's throwing the lightning bolts. He's the God of the world and of the universe, and he's God of lightning and storms and everything else. He's the one who commands the winds and the lightning in his fists, including Satan. Satan is at God's command with lightning, just like lightning is at the command of Zeus, as how you know it to be. That's an idiom designed to show you that God is really the one in sovereign control. And we talk about that in the Satan series, but this is an example of how people misinterpret things and say, oh, you see, the God they worshiped is actually Zeus. And it's like, no, you need to understand the context of what's being done here. And the fact that these people appropriated pagan things. Not, when I say appropriate, I don't mean how the Catholic Church created, baptized paganism. I'm talking appropriation in a different sense, where basically they're boasting in the Lord by showing that God is the actual fulfillment of all these things, of the one who controls the lightning, for example. But anyway, this is the problem. And people have created all kinds of mythology as a result. This is from bigthink.com. Let there be God, how Yahweh became God Almighty. In the Canaan religion, Yahweh was a lesser god who was assigned the land of Israel. Here's how he became God Almighty. Well, we know that he's always been God Almighty, but either way, Yahweh worship can be traced back all the way to the ancient religion of Canaan. In the Northwestern Semitic language spoken there, El had multiple meanings. It was the word for God, the name of a specific god, and the title of a god who stood removed from other lesser gods. These lesser gods included Yahweh, who was assigned the land of Israel. In time, the Israelites referred to Yahweh as El Shaddai, God Almighty. Now, remember, this is Canaanite mythology. Very important that you understand this. And there's a reason why it's the way it is. According to the book of Exodus, which is part of the Torah and the Old Testament and the Christian Bible, Moses was the first person to whom the God of Abraham revealed his name. In the original text, this divine name was written Yahweh, Yod-He-Vav-He. Scholars say Yahweh is most likely derived from the Hebrew verb hayah, which means to be. This is fitting considering that God's initial response to Moses was, I am who I am. In reality, the name Yahweh, commonly written as Yahweh, YHWH, already existed before Moses, who is believed to have lived during the 13th century BC. And you see, they have the wrong date for the Exodus. So that should tell you everything, because the Exodus happened in the 15th century BC. This inference is based not only on the archaeological evidence, but also on the scriptures themselves. Is it? The name Yahweh, after all, can be found in the book of Genesis. Yes, it can. What does that mean? In that same book, we are also told that people started to call upon Yahweh's name as early as the time of Enoch, who lived long before Moses. This is an interesting point, but of course, they're not going to use this point to give glory to God, and we will touch on this point later. But people called out to Yahweh before the flood. This begs the question, where and when did worship of Yahweh first originate? It's not an easy question to answer. Theology professor Lowell Handy, author of Among the Host of Heaven, says that you should not even bother. Most religious traditions go back so far in time that any information about them becomes so fragmented as to be virtually non-existent. Well, this is from a secular point of view, which doesn't have an objective, perfect source of information like we do as believers in the Word of God. They say, oh, you can't really know. Well, we do know what God has revealed because it's been preserved and it's perfect. Moving on, a good deal of studies available on the subject also suffer from confirmation bias, with authors bending over backwards in an effort to connect the origins of the Abrahamic religions to their own cultural, ethnic, or religious backgrounds. Some believers might claim that studying the birth of God as a social construct is itself an act of blasphemy. But much of the time, however, such studies come from a place of interest rather than disbelief. The origins of Yahweh worship. The first historical document pointing toward the existence of Yahweh worship is an Egyptian inscription, which we talked about, and the Soleb inscription, where you had the Shasu of Yahweh. The Shasu were a nomadic tribe who lived in northern Arabia. Yahweh, meanwhile, was the name of a place located somewhere in that region. Now, do you remember how that other article said that there's no such reason to believe that there's any place in existence that ever had the name Yahweh? So this is misinformed. They had the wrong date for the Exodus, and they're telling you another historical misappropriation. This is not true. There is no place named Yahweh. It's not the Shasu of a particular place. It's the Shasu of a being, which is important. But of course, they don't. This is a secular website. That's why I want to show it to you. The Dutch historian of religions Cornelis Thiel, who studied the Shasu, proposed that the worship of Yahweh did not originate in the land of Canaan, as described in the Bible, but was adopted by the proto-Israelites through sustained contact with inhabitants of the Arabian Peninsula. His hypothesis is not just supported by archaeological evidence. In the Exodus, Yahweh reveals himself to Moses, while the latter is in the company of the nomadic Kenites. One God among many. Yahweh worship also has its roots in an ancient religion of Canaan, the land of which God promised to Abraham. Within this polytheistic religion, Yahweh was but one of the many deities united under a figure known as El. In the northwestern Semitic language spoken in Canaan, El had multiple meanings. It was the word for God, the name of a specific god, and the title of a god who stood removed from other lesser gods. The lesser gods included Yahweh, Asherah, El's consort, as well as the religion's chief mother goddess, and Baal, or Baal, whose worshippers went on to challenge Yahweh's supremacy in Israel. Yahweh and Baal were merely two of El's 70 children. Again, this is a secular article. They're wrong, but we're going to expose it. According to the mythology, each child of El was given a region to look after. Baal ruled over Canaan, while Yahweh faithfully was assigned the land of Israel. But keep this in mind, though. Keep all this in mind, because it'll come in handy in just a second when we break it all down. Like the ancient Near Eastern myths from the same period, the earliest biblical literature describes Yahweh as possessing particular as opposed to general attributes. He's represented as a storm god who marches into battle alongside stars and plans to defend Israel from enemies. This is the Canaanite mythology about Yahweh. This warrior-like iteration of Yahweh may explain the brutal and volatile behavior he exhibits in the Old Testament, which is a far cry from the omnibenevolent deity we find in Christ. Is it really? We'll talk about this too, because this is this is the problem. You see, these people are secular, probably atheists, who knows what they are, but they certainly aren't born-again Christians. Otherwise, they wouldn't be writing like this. But you see the problem? Because they reject the word of God as objectively true, what results as a result? Well, they're also going to reject God's character and say, well, all these things that happen in the Old Testament, it seems like this God is just really bloodthirsty. He's very different from Jesus, which of course is not true. Jesus is Yahweh, and Jesus is coming back to destroy the wicked and throw them in the lake of fire. He's going to have a blood-stained robe from his enemies. So there's that. From polytheism to monotheism. When nation-states first emerged in the Levant during the late Iron Age, El's vassals were promoted in their respective mythological hierarchies. Shamash came to occupy an important role in the kingdom of Moab because Moab had originally been assigned to him by El. The same thing happened to Milcom and Quaz, who were gods of the Ammonites and Edomites, respectively. Yahweh, as mentioned, became the chief god of Israel. There's a picture of something, let's see, a statue of Baal. Yahweh's supremacy in Israel did not go uncontested. When the Israeli king Ahab married the Lebanese princess Jezebel in the 8th century BC, Yahweh's priests were fiercely persecuted while Yahweh himself was replaced by Baal and Asherah. Ultimately, however, faith in Yahweh proved too entrenched to erase. Ahab's dynasty was deposed of, and Jezebel died by defenestration, that is, being thrown out of window. Do you notice how the slant is like, oh, well, I guess all this superstition in Yahweh was just too hard to get rid of? No, it's because Yahweh is God, and he prophesied that Ahab and Jezebel would die a certain way, and that's the way they died. And so he's sovereign. But of course, again, this is the slant. Yahweh worship bounced back stronger than ever. Their power restored. Priests officially condemned the veneration of other false gods. Idols of Baal, Asherah were destroyed. In time, their qualities were assimilated into Yahweh, who came to be referred as El Shaddai, a title which roughly translates into English as God Almighty. Oh my goodness, so what do we do with this? There's still more to read, but just a quick break. Does this mean that Yahweh was actually just a pagan god that got assimilated by the Israelites after just a chance victory? And, one side won, and so that now that's the reason why we have Yahweh? This is what this article seems to suggest, and a lot of people buy into this nonsense. Yes, the names El and the suffixes of various Canaanite El and El Shaddai and all these kind of things were appropriated to God after the Canaanites were taken over. But he's wrong when he says in time their qualities were assimilated into... What do you mean the qualities of Asherah? No. People who are faithful in the Old Testament never worship Yahweh as like a mother goddess or like fertility or anything like that. That's nonsense. So this is a lie. So when he says their qualities, this is lying. It's not true. Yes, the name El was absorbed into Hebrew to appropriate to God with all the titles that we talked about. And we'll talk about why that's the case. But so far, this is exactly what we're dealing with, folks. And if you are not strong in your faith and you read something like this, you're like, oh my goodness, what do I do with this? This is from Quora. Let's see. Is Yahweh a pagan god, and how does it affect Christianity? Yes, and the best evidence of this can be found in the Old Testament. The original polytheistic beliefs of the Hebrews, El Elyon was the chief, and Yahweh was one of the 70 sons of his God. This God. The Dead Sea Scroll discovery of the Old Testament confirms this without dispute. Without dispute, it confirms it, apparently. For example, Deuteronomy 32:8, we're going to talk about Deuteronomy 32:8, talks about the Most High God, El Elyon, dividing the nations according to the number of his sons. In the Septuagint and Qumran version of Deuteronomy 32:8-9, El Elyon divides the world up into different nations, one of each for his sons. Yahweh gets Israel, while the other gods get the other nations. Here is the translation of the text. When the Most High, El Elyon, gave to the nations their inheritance, when he separated the sons of men, he fixed the bounds of the peoples according to the number of the sons of God, El. For Yahweh's portion is his people. Jacob is the lot of his inheritance. Does that mean that we're dealing with two different gods? What's going on? Of course, you should know the answer by now. Poor context is what's going on. In the original language, the text says that Jacob is the allotment of Yahweh's inheritance. The returning priests from exile in Babylon brought back the first true belief in monotheism. That is, there is only one God in existence. Isaiah 44:6 contains the first clear statement of monotheism. I am the first and I am the last besides me. Who is speaking in Isaiah 44:6, commentator? Who's speaking? Do you remember? You should remember, because that's a good one to memorize. It's Yahweh that's speaking. So the person is refuting themselves in this comment. But anyway, might as well give them a platform so you can understand and we can expose the works of darkness. Prior to this, there was a belief in henotheism during the First Temple period, that is the worship of a sole national god, but still recognizing that other nations have their own god. No, they recognized that other nations had false gods and that they had the true God. This is just poor history. The book of Isaiah is a product of three writers. Deutera or Second Isaiah, chapters 40 through 55, it is the work of an anonymous 6th century author writing during the exile and is the author of the passage code. Do you remember the article we read about how this argument that Isaiah is written by multiple authors is just totally wrong and there's no substance to it whatsoever? It's just a poor argument. Exactly. This is the model of monotheism which became the defining characteristic of post-exilic Judaism. There's no such thing. Judaism after the exile was rabbinic Judaism. Before that, it was the Levitical religion. Of course, they were parallel side by side until the temple was destroyed again. But anyway. And finally, the basis for Christianity and Islam. So therefore, there you go. Christianity is fake, and you can't trust Christianity and Islam and all these pagan religions. You got to be your own God. Here's another one. Is Yahweh not a god but a demon? My goodness. I'm not an anti-Semitic or a neo-Nazi conspiracy theorist, but I am none of them. I'm a student of religion and history from India. My research on the history of the world religion tells me that the Aryan pagan culture of both the East and the West were victimized. The truest form of Aryan pagan religion survives in India and in Japan, where Shintoism was heavily inspired by Hinduism. When I study the origin of history of religion in India, I see that there had been a continuous effort to undermine, destroy the priestly class, Brahmins of India, through massacre in the times of Muslim invasion of British Christian rule, and now by demonizing them through the media. The Vedas were the first ever literature on religion that were loved by the Nazis. Well, the Nazis loved the occult too, followed by the Upanishads, philosophical treatises having much similarity to Greek and pagan philosophy. It's all just one mystery religion, folks. In the times when Alexander invaded India and brought all that mystery religion to the Western world, both the societies were pagan and there was no clash of cultures or religions. It was a beautiful fusion that resulted in Greco-Buddhism of Afghanistan, later destroyed by the Arab and Turk Muslims, which assimilated these things into Manichaeism and Gnosticism. It's all just the same stuff. The ancient culture of European paganism was destroyed by Christianity. Zoroastrianism of Persia, Aryan, was destroyed by Islam. The pagan culture of Arabs was destroyed by Islam. Both Islam and Christianity tried to destroy the pagan culture of India, but failed. The so-called religious wars in the history of mankind began after the emergence of Judaism, yada, 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 though there has been a continuous effort to portray that it began with the Buddhist persecution of the Hindus, where it was a fight between Buddhist kings and Hindu kings, not common people. Yahweh, or whatever you want to call it, has only brought misery to the world. Such a sad state of affairs to be so deceived. The Aryan religions were of honor and understanding both in theory and in practice. Now you can find a little corruption in Hinduism due to the various socioeconomic reasons and influence of persecution, blah, blah, blah. Judaism, Christianity, or Islam that had conflicting nature brought chaos and war of faith. No, Catholicism brought chaos and war to the world, not Christianity. Again, this is the problem with people here. And we still live in a blank up world. Hitler was right about one thing. The destruction of Aryan culture was the main agenda of the Semites. So I guess I had to call Yahweh a demon rather than a god. My goodness. Oh, may God be merciful and open this person's eyes. There's so many things on this forum. There's one thing that I forget where it was. It was one comment or another that I want to read. But the point is, you see what we're dealing with, hopefully. You see what's going on. This is from a forum on citydata.com. The evolution of Yahweh, the pagan tribal god of Israel. Let's see if we can get a nice... Oh, gosh, these sites are so poorly formatted. Now I'm going to have to squint and get a microscope to read this to you. It appears that Yahweh... Sorry that you can't read, but it is what it is. It appears that Yahweh, the tribal god of Israel, started out as one of the many pagan deities in a polytheistic culture. The Canaanite religion predates the Proto-Judaic religion. There you go. That's where it started. In the Ugarit belief system, El Elyon, El the Most High, or El of the Mountains, was the chief of the gods. He had a wife, Asherah, and had 70 sons, among which were Yahweh, the god of storms, and Baal. Elements of the Canaanite belief system can be seen in the Old Testament, in the parts written before Judaism became monotheistic. Again, you see the same error of thinking. The unbroken chain of the elect have always been monotheistic. Adam, Enoch, Noah, Job, Abraham, Moses. It's always been a relationship with one God, always. But these are misunderstandings. For example, where the Old Testament talks about Elohim, this would be the heavenly court of El, comprised of him, his wife, and all their sons and their son. No, it doesn't. Also in Job, Genesis, and Deuteronomy, where you see the term sons of God, in the original the phrase was sons of El. Conveniently changed when the Jews became monotheistic after their Babylonian exile. Oh, there's a conspiracy. Gosh, this is just half-truths because, people want to find conspiracies. People know, okay, there's something up with the Jewish version of history. And so they read these things and they get their nice scratchy scratches on their ears and they say, oh, this must be true. Of course, it's not. Also in 1 Kings 22:19-22, we read of Yahweh meeting with his heavenly council. This is the very description of heaven which one finds in the Ugaritic texts. We'll read about those. For in those texts, the sons of God are the sons of El, the chief Canaanite god. El had 70 sons, one of which was purported to be Yahweh. Deuteronomy 32:8-9, which again we'll look at, don't worry, is usually cited to support this, where basically, again, El Elyon apportions to the nations. He divides it according to the numbers of the sons of God. Yahweh's own portion was his people. Jacob's his allotted share. Now, the word here is own. Yahweh's own portion, i.e. apart from the 70 sons of God that were given to watch over the nations and rebelled. Moving on, there is one Ugaritic text which seems to indicate that among the inhabitants of Ugarit, Yahweh was viewed as another son of El. And this particular text says, the name of the Son of God, Yahweh, which is interesting if you understand that the Bible is the truth, that there's the angel of Yahweh, that the Godhead is multi-personal. There's some truth in these statements, but you have to see these from Scripture being the truth, not from the pagan sources being the truth, because they had every reason to mythologize these things. But there is some truth here, if you're catching on to it. This text seems to show that Yahweh was known at Ugarit, though not as the Lord, but as one of these many sons of El. A couple of other interesting texts. Psalm 82:1, Elohim has taken his place in the assembly of El. In the midst of the Elohim, he holds judgment. Psalm 29, verse 1, ascribe to Yahweh, O sons of El, ascribe to Yahweh glory and strength. Which again, remember, some of these, like Elohim and Adonai, were added later because of the superstition of the sacred name. Psalm 89, verse 6, for who in the skies can be compared to Yahweh? Who among the sons of El is like Yahweh? It appears that the Hebrew theologians adopted the titles of the Canaanite gods and attributed them to Yahweh in an effort to eliminate them. Conspiracy. So the Jews basically tried to conspire against the pagan gods to try to remove them, and so they assimilated into Yahweh and created this almighty God that really didn't exist. He was just a pagan tribal deity, but they elevated him so that they could eliminate these pagan competitors. Names that used to stand out for specific deities were now assimilated and even used as alternative names for Yahweh. having Yahweh taken on the characteristics and even the names of many of the other popular gods would mean there would no longer be a need for the Canaanite gods to exist. The process is known as assimilation. And I think that's all in this forum. So there's that. Let's see another one. This is from World History Encyclopedia. Yahweh, and we read as follows. As the name of the Supreme Being was considered too holy to be spoken, the consonants Yahweh were used to remind one to say the word Adonai, Lord, in place of God's name, a common practice throughout the Near East in which epithets were used in referencing a deity. All of these stipulations and details were applied to the god later. However, it is unclear exactly when Yahweh was first worshipped, by whom or how. Well, again, it's clear if you believe the Bible is true. Scholars J. Maxwell Miller and John H. Hayes write the following. The origins of Yahwism are hidden in mystery. Even the final edited form of Genesis and 2 Kings presents diverse views on the matter. Thus, Genesis 4:16, attributed by literary critics to the so-called Yahwistic source, traces the worship of Yahweh back to the earliest days of the human race, while other passages trace the revelation and worship of Yahweh back to Moses. Scholar Nizim Amzalag of Ben-Gurion University disagrees with the claim that Yahweh's origins are obscure and argues that the deity was originally a god of the forge and patron of metallurgists during the Bronze Age. Amzalag specifically cites the ancient copper mines of the Timna Valley in southern Israel, biblical and extra-biblical passages, and similarities of Yahweh to gods of metallurgy and other cultures for support. Yes, there are other cultures that have mythologies of Yahweh. This is true. But what does that mean? That's the important thing. What lens do you use to interpret that information? Although the Bible, and specifically the book of Exodus, presents Yahweh as the God of the Israelites, there are many passages which make clear that this deity was also worshipped by other peoples in Canaan. Amzalag notes that the Edomites, Kenites, Moabites, and Midianites all worship Yahweh to one degree or another, and that there is evidence the Edomites who operated the mines in Timnah converted an earlier Egyptian temple of Hathor to the worship of Yahweh. Although the biblical narratives depict Yahweh as the sole creator God, Lord of the universe, and God of the Israelites especially, initially he seemed to have been the Canaanite god in origin and subordinate to the supreme god El. Canaanite inscriptions mention a lesser god Yahweh, and even the biblical book of Deuteronomy stipulates the Most High, El, gave to the nations their inheritance. Are you seeing a pattern of how these people are interpreting these verses? We'll break it down. It's going to be really easy to spot, but these people don't have the lens of Scripture as being the authoritative source, and they're not being guided by the Spirit, so what's the only possible outcome? Well, the outcome is heresy and misinterpretation. A passage like this reflects the early beliefs of the Canaanites and Israelites in polytheism, or more accurately, henotheism, the belief in many gods with a focus on a singular supreme deity. The claim that Israel will always only acknowledge one God is a later belief cast back on the early days of Israel's development in Canaan. All these people believe that Israel was initially kind of polytheistic, but God was kind of the main God, i.e. kind of like the Canaanites, how they believed it. So they believed that Israelites had some kind of a similar religion, which is not true. God's elect always had a relationship with him. They didn't have other gods that they believed in. Sure, they believed there were other supernatural beings or spirits, but they knew that there was only one God. But this is, again, a misinterpretation because they don't have the lens of proper history. So anyway, that's the argument from the World History Encyclopedia, which obviously you can tell is very secular. One more to go. This is Wikipedia now. Yahweh. Yahweh was an ancient Levantine deity, the national god of the Israelite kingdoms of Israel and Judah, and later the god of Judaism and its other descendant Abrahamic religions. Well, it's not the god of Judaism, that's for sure. Though no consensus exists regarding the deity's origins, scholars generally contend that Yahweh is associated with Seir, Edom, Paran, and Teman, and later Canaan. The origins of this worship reach at least into the early Iron Age and likely into the late Bronze Age, if not somewhat earlier. This is some sort of inscription. The god on the winged wheel, a 4th century BCE silver coin, possibly representing Yahweh and thrown on a winged wheel. This identification is disputed, however. Well, we know there is a vision from Ezekiel that was very supernatural in origin, with living beings that were wheels, and there was a throne, and so who knows? Could be something. In the oldest biblical literature, he possesses attributes typically ascribed to weather and war deities, fructifying the land and leading the heavenly army against Israel's enemies. The early Israelites were polytheistic and worshiped Yahweh alongside a variety of Canaanite gods and goddesses, including El, Asherah, and Bel. This is not true. This is a half-truth. This is a very cleverly misrepresented statement. Are we talking about the elect? Or are we talking about the reprobate? Yeah, Manasseh, who was reprobate, and all these other people who were, although I think Manasseh repented, so I could be wrong about that. But anyway, people who were really bad and who basically went the way of the wind, yeah, they worshipped many gods. But the elect worshipped only one God, always. This is the part that people don't get. And because they don't get that, and they don't understand God is sovereign, has a plan of salvation that he's working through history, they see these things and they say, oh, well, gosh, it must mean that Yahweh was just another pagan god, which of course is not true. In later centuries, El and Yahweh became conflated, and El-linked epithets such as El Shaddai or El Elyon came to be applied to Yahweh alone. Some scholars believe El and Yahweh were always conflated. Characteristics of other gods, such as Asherah and Bel, were also selectively absorbed in conceptions of Yahweh. Was Yahweh ever worshipped in the Bible as the mother goddess? I don't think so. Come on. Over time, the existence of other gods was denied, and Yahweh was proclaimed as the creator deity and the sole divinity to be worshipped. Well, really quick, full stop. Moses wrote the Pentateuch, and Moses wrote that Yahweh created the universe. That was in 1400 BC, before the Israelites came to Canaan. So there's that. During the Second Temple period, speaking the name of Yahweh in public became regarded as a taboo, and Jews instead began to substitute other words, primarily Adonai. That part we know. In Roman times, following the siege of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple, the original pronunciation of the god's name was forgotten entirely. Yahweh is also invoked in Papyrus Amherst 63 and in Jewish-influenced Greco-Egyptian magical text from the 1st to the 5th century. So again, now we start to see, after Jesus and with Rabbinic Judaism and Kabbalism and all the things that I talk about in my Masoretic episode, that the evolution of the magical alphabet, and of course people using the Tetragrammaton for occult purposes, which we'll talk about too, starts to come to the forefront. So what does that mean? Well, it just means that the devil is very hard at work. That's all that means. So what do we make of all these things? Conclusion, my goodness, it just never ends. And like I said, when I was composing this presentation, I'm like, man, there's just so much deception. So much deception. I don't want you to get snared or thrown off by these pseudo-historical things that seem to be very convincing. I've heard many people believe these things, but this is ultimately poor scholarship, and it's lacking an objective source of truth. That's why they're so confused and contradicting it like themselves. Notice the bias throughout these articles. Notice the bias. What's the underlying theme in all these articles? The underlying theme is the Bible can't be trusted. It's not the primary evidence about who God is. There is no God. There's just maybe what people believed in a tribal God. And of course, the pagan sources are the ones that are actually the authority. Do you understand the ridiculousness of this? Because they don't have, so what's the point? Because they don't have an objective standard in God's word, they trust whatever's pagan. Oh, well, this pagan source is older than this pagan source, so maybe that's what came first. Well, the Bible tells you that Yahweh created the world, so Yahweh was before all things. Therefore, the Bible is the one that's telling you the truth, not the pagans who are always mythologizing and creating all sorts of stories. So how do we respond to all these things? Because again, if you just read these on face value, it's a little disconcerting, right? It's like, oh man, this seems pretty historical. What do we do with this? Is this really what's going on? Can the Bible be trusted? And of course it can be trusted. A couple points to respond. Number one is that we reaffirm the Bible as the inerrant word of God. That's number one. You have to get back to the basics, because the foundational lens that these people and other people who are arguing like them, the first error they make is that they do not believe the Bible is the word of God. Because if you do, then you would take the word of God as the primary source of evidence. We know the Bible is a supernatural book revealing a supernatural creator. How do we know that? Well, in other places like my Berean video, I covered the 60,000 plus cross-references that have been studied and mapped out, whereas that would be impossible with a text composed over 1,500 years by, I don't know how many dozens of authors. It's impossible. You cannot reproduce that with just human effort. Bible prophecies that have been fulfilled, which we have archaeological evidence for, archaeological evidence in general for the Old Testament and the New Testament that proves that these things actually happened, countless manuscripts that obviously most of them agree. There's textual variance, but most of them agree. So there's a consistent message. And of course, the claims that the Bible makes about there has to be a creator. That creator is perfectly just, and therefore, how do you solve the problem of being reconciled to that creator so that you can live? And the answer is the gospel. There's no other answer. The answer is the gospel. The propitiation that Jesus offers on your behalf because Adam failed, who was your representative. Everything about the Bible is completely consistent. So the consistency, the cross-referencing, the Bible prophecies, the archaeological evidence, all of these things prove to us that we're dealing with something supernatural. And if you've read the Bible, honestly, you see how completely consistent it is. I have yet to see anything that doesn't make sense in the sense that it's a contradiction or it's wrong. If it's something that's difficult, it's always a chance to go deeper. But most people, because they aren't born again, they see something that's difficult and they go the wrong way, and Satan devours their mind. So we have to reaffirm the Bible as the inerrant word of God. Once we do that, we look at the archaeological evidence. Well, the archaeological evidence says what? The Soleb inscription is from 1400 BC, and it proves that Yahweh was Israel's God before they entered the Promised Land. Right? It was, around that time, but either way, that was way before they had lots of interaction with the Canaanites. It was right after their exodus. You also have the Ketef Hinnom scrolls, which we looked at. We'll pull them up again. These are the Ketef Hinnom scrolls. And there's a lot of important things here because they say, Yahweh bless you, Yahweh keep you. These scrolls are among a collection of 1,000 objects found inside the tomb edge of Hinnom Valley. The scrolls are 99% pure silver. Barkey believes the scrolls may have been worn as amulets. Their somewhat fragmentary text reads as follows. The great blank who keeps the covenant and gracious towards those who love him and those who keep his commandments. The eternal blessing than any and more than evil. For redemption is in him. For Yahweh is our restorer and our rock. May Yahweh bless you and keep you, and may Yahweh make his face shine, blank, blank, blank. So obviously some of the words are taken out. Paralleling other Bible verses like in Deuteronomy. Here's amulet 2. This says, may he, she be blessed by Yahweh, the warrior, helper, and the rebuker of evil. May Yahweh bless you and keep you. May Yahweh cause his face to shine upon you and grant you peace. Again, people were blessing each other in the name of God. That was a common thing. Paralleling the following verses in Numbers 6. The parallel wording is even more obvious when directly comparing the Hebrew letter on the amulets to the Hebrew scriptures. The exact letter accuracy preserved and continued in the Hebrew Bible for over 2.5 millenniums to this day is truly remarkable to see. Yeah, because God is sovereign and he preserves his word. And again, not through specific translations, but he preserves the meaning. And of course, here's kind of a graphic that we looked at. The scrolls were dated based on the script and the artifacts around them to the late 7th and early 6th centuries, predating the Dead Sea Scrolls by 500 years, at least. Their writing form matched what was used before the conquest of Judah by Nebuchadnezzar in the early 6th century, similar, for example, to letters found at the biblical city of Lachish, i.e., it was original Hebrew. And of course, original Hebrew is the actual Paleo-Hebrew name of Yahweh. But what's the point? These Ketef Hinnom scrolls prove that Yahweh, first off, we have the Soleb inscription. Well, actually, if we go even before that, the Bible says Yahweh created the world in Genesis 2. Okay, really Genesis 1, because Elohim, Yahweh, they're the same being. But Yahweh's the one who created. So that means Yahweh existed before creation. Then you have archaeological evidence, which proves that the Exodus did happen, because you had these nomadic people that worship Yahweh. And of course, Moses wrote the Pentateuch. That was 1400 BC. Then you had Ketef Hinnom scrolls, which show that people were blessing each other in the name of Yahweh, which is consistent with what we have in the Bible, meaning there's a consistent thread of worshiping God as the creator, the provider, the redeemer, as Yahweh. This wasn't something that if they stole from the Canaanites. This wasn't something that they grew, the Yahweh kind of grew from, well, he was a minor god to now he's a major god. It's nonsense. Doesn't agree with the historical evidence, not whatsoever. The Ketef Hinnom scrolls prove that Yahweh was the same God before the Babylonian exile as it was at the Exodus and when creation happened with Adam and Noah and Abraham and all the people who interacted with Yahweh according to the Bible. But of course, if you reject the Bible, this is what happens. Now, we have one more to look at because there's an objection to this with some of the evidence, which is that people again say is the iota, alpha, omega in Greek a pagan deity? Is Yao a pagan solar deity? And there's an article I found on it that's very good defense of the topic. This is from ChristianThinkTank.com. Question, was Yahweh just a pagan solar deity? IAO, or iota, alpha, omega. Yao. Dear Glenn, my name is such and such, and I was wondering if you can help me. I'm a Christian, and some time ago I was looking on a website about God's name, YHWH, in Hebrew, and it said that in Greek it was written as IAO. Remember that we saw an old manuscript in the Septuagint in the 1st century BC that they transliterated like this. And then later in the early church, Clement and other people transliterated also IAOU, Yahweh, all the way through. But the early ones were transcribed just the first couple of vowels, Yahweh, which means iota, alpha, omega, which I think is interesting too. There's alpha and omega in God's name in Greek, so that's cool. So I looked it up in Wikipedia, and the person who wrote the article said that Yao was actually called the god of the 7 rays, and it was a sun god. Conspiracy. So I had another look around, and I found out that Yao was also used in Gnosticism, and it was associated with the Nubis, which is Egyptian Gnostic solar icon, and that has 7 rays coming out of the head. If you can, would you look into it for me? I'm a bit confused. Thanks. Let's see what this person responds. And who's the person responding? I don't know. This is written in 2009, so it's a little while ago. Oddly enough, the use of IAO by the post-New Testament Gnostics was specifically done to confuse its audience. Meaning they knew God's name and they were doing it to confuse people. So their practice of borrowing names from antecedent religion system is still working, i.e. because it's still confusing people. By the way, Wikipedia resources on this topic point out that they are used based on a 19th century scholarly work, which has long been superseded by more current research. Read a couple of things here. So he lists off a couple points. Some of these we've reviewed, and we'll review them here as well. The consonants have a long history in the historical text. So there are literary remains that use the ancient Hebrew consonantal letters as far back as the 11th century BC. This Hebrew name of God predates Gnosticism by at least 1,000 years, a millennium. Quote, it's the name Yahweh. Earliest appearances are in the Song of Deborah, Judges 5, which has been dated to the 11th century BC, on the Mesha Stele, 9th century, in the Ostracon from Kuntilet, Ajrut, 8th century, in the Arad and Lashish letters, 6th century. To move outside of the Levant, we find Egyptian name lists which include a Syrian site, Yahuwah, number 97, which is identical to Yahweh. A Ramses II list is found in the Nubian temple in Amra, west, with 6 names, following the designation Bedouin area. Numbers 96 through 98 have been found at Soleb in Nubia on an Amon temple of Amun-Toab III. We looked at this one from 1400 BC. Number 93, Sa'ar, has been identified with Seir Edom and related to the biblical references in Deuteronomy 33, verse 2, which associate Yahweh with Seir and Paran. This could be taken as reference or as evidence that the name was known in Edom or Midianite territory. However, Astur notes that writing SRR is incorrect, as opposed to the spelling in other Egyptian inscriptions. Furthermore, 3 of the sites, including Yiha, or Ramses III's temple in Medinet Habu, are in the Syrian context, suggesting that Yahweh, Yiha, was also in Syria. Thus, the name is not associated with Edom or Midianites, but does seem to appear as early as 1400 BC in Syria. All these things are pointing to a much older date than what these people believe. From a later time, the 8th century BC, 2 Aramean princes have names with the element Yao. This has been taken to mean that some Arameans may have worshipped Yahweh as well. We'll look at this in another future link too, because again, you can determine these things through history of people's names and seeing how, okay, they're naming people after Yah, these sequence of vowels, which can only mean one thing. There's obviously people knew about Yahweh. And that's something to remember, that they knew about Yahweh, but of course they didn't know Yahweh, which is the distinction. This could relate to earlier connection of the patriarchs with the Arameans, i.e. Jacob's sojourn with Laban, the eponymous ancestor of the Arameans. The divine name is not found in any cuneiform text. The formative YW in some personal names from Ugarit is not a divine element and has no connection with the name Yahweh. Next point. When the Hebrew Bible begins to be translated into Greek, most indications are the Hebrew letters YHWH were not actually transliterated into IAO, iota, alpha, omega. They were written in Hebrew letters inside the Greek text. So the fact that the deity under discussion was the Hebrew God and not some other deity named Yahweh was fairly clear. Quote, at the end of the last century, Giovanni Cardinal Mercati discovered a palimpsest in the Ambrosian Library of Milan containing parts of the Psalter to Origen's Hexapla. I talk about Origen's Hexapla in the Masoretic text. This was a compilation of various texts that he did to compare various texts. And of course, he also realized the tamperings of the Jews at that point. All the columns show the Tetragrammaton written in square Aramaic script, although the texts are otherwise written in Greek, which is an interesting situation. Because remember, the IAO that we saw the manuscript of was from the 1st century, but the Septuagint was written in 250 BC, which is 150 years before that. So it seems initially when the Jews copied, they didn't want to, again, the Jews were very picky about idolatry and making sure they didn't blaspheme God's name. So they put it in Aramaic square script, even though the other rest of the text was Greek. These fragments show the Tetragrammaton written into Greek columns of Aquila, Symmachus, and the Septuagint in the strange form of pi. This is a clumsy attempt to represent with Greek letters what the Tetragrammaton look like in Hebrew. The Greek letter pi somewhat resembles the Hebrew letter he. If you remember, it's like, it's like a little h, not even an h, but kind of like the letter pi, sort of, kind of like an n, maybe like a lowercase n. And so they were trying to represent it physically. So they wrote pi, but it's, phonetically it doesn't make sense to say pi. The Greek letter pi somewhat resembles the Hebrew letter he, and the Fuad papyrus scroll is the earliest example we have examined, dating to the 1st or 2nd century BC. Here, for the first time, we have clear evidence that in pre-Christian times, the Septuagint, at least sometimes, did not translate the divine name with the Greek word Kyrios, as had been thought. Rather, it preserved the Hebrew word Yahweh itself. The original transcriptions of the Septuagint had this. So the oldest Fuad papyrus of the Septuagint reveals that. Of course, that changed over time. But anyway, could it be that Jews had always written the Tetragrammaton in Hebrew into the text of their Greek Bibles, and that this practice represented a continuous tradition from the earliest Septuagint through the 2nd century translations of Aquila, Symmachus, and Theodotion? Which, by the way, these 3 translations were the ones that they made to try to discredit Christ. But either way, understanding a consistent theme here. Or is the Fuad manuscript a maverick, the only one in its day to do such a thing? Good question. In 1952, fragments of a scroll of the 12 prophets in Greek were found in a cave at Nahal Hever in the Judean desert. Pere di Bartholomew announced the discovery of the scroll in 1953, and 10 years later published a transcription of it. In all probability, the document dates to the beginning of the 1st Christian century. Like the Fuad papyrus, it too writes the Tetragrammaton in Hebrew, in old-style script, in an otherwise Greek text. At Qumran, Cave 4, a fragment of the Greek translation of the book of Leviticus, confirms that the divine name was preserved in the pre-Christian Septuagint. In this scroll, dated by P.W. Skehan to the 1st century BC, the Tetragrammaton is transliterated with the Greek letters I, A, O. So there were a lot of practices that were happening, but eventually, what the point is that some of the Greek-speaking Jews also translated the divine name into iota, alpha, omega. So, let's see what the next one. In the existing mainstream Septuagint, Yahweh is rendered as Kyrios, Lord, most of the time, and the divine name is not preserved in post-New Testament Septuagint versions. So when the Septuagint was copied and copied and copied after the New Testament, it was, Yahweh, the divine name had been lost in translation into Kyrios, or Lord. The one exception is in Septuagint for 1 Chronicles 8, verse 10, in which the name Uz is rendered Yaos, which is interesting. But as early as the 2nd century BC, still 300 years before Gnosticism and magical practice began to use the name. This is important for later when we talk about, is Yahweh an occult name? So before the occultists started to snatch onto that, you have to understand what was first, which is Yahweh, the revelation of God's name, before the occult started using it. So 300 years before Gnosticism and the magical practice, we have the rendering of Yahweh into IAO. But I have no idea how they came up with iota, alpha, omega from yod, he, vav, or wav, he, or even for the shortened term Yahu, or Yahu. Probably, I'm guessing Yao, iota, alpha, omega, Yao, but it is not uniformly rendered as IAO. It takes on different forms. IAO is not a fixed term here, as would be the case if it were referring to some predecessor deity. The Greek version of Yahweh shows up in at least 5 different forms, indicating both the pronunciation vocalization had been lost and that some fixed name deity IAO was not being referred to. So again, this is responding to the claim that IAO is some solar deity, which of course is nonsense. The pronunciation got lost in translation. We talked about these in another article where you had the Latin translations were Yahweh, but again, U can be represented with a V or a U. And so when the Greeks saw the Latin translated from I-A-U-E, Yahweh, in Greek, I-A-V-E, Yahweh, but it's actually Yahweh. In Greek, B and V are interchangeable, and so they transliterate it to I-A-B-E, Yahweh. That doesn't make any sense reading it in English. But it also doesn't make sense reading it necessarily in Greek too, because I think in Greek, the B is pronounced B. But anyway, maybe that sounds confusing, but the point is that these things get lost in translation. We talked about the different spellings of Clement of Alexandria, Epiphanius, Yahweh, Yahweh, Yahweh. Next point. But this IAO was not understood as anything other than the name of the Jewish God. And an original Jewish term, not a pagan one, showing up in Jewish Aramaic documents in the 5th century BC. So even in the earliest passages in which it is rendered IAO, it is either explicitly or implicitly referring to the biblical God of the Jews. Quote, as the name of the Jewish God is the first mentioned by Diodorus Siculus and by Varro, it is an original Jewish term which is well attested by the Aramaic papyri from Elephantine from the Persian period. Citation. It does not occur in the Textus Receptus of the Septuagint, having become a vocabulum ineffabile for the Jews, meaning something that's not pronounced. But it does appear on a fragment of the Septuagint version of Leviticus, probably from the 1st century BC, which we looked at. Remember the one in Wikipedia? A little graphic of that with it says IAO. Thus, exactly from the same time as Diodorus, who was affirming that this is the God of the Jews. Next point. Beginning fairly early, Greek historians and writers who discussed Judaism used IAO as a reference to the Jewish God. It did not identify Yahweh with some solar deity. There were solar deities, of course, but when the Jewish God is mentioned in connection with them, it is a superior and all-encompassing God, not as an explicitly solar deity. This extended quote from Van Couten's article, Moses and His God Yahweh, Yao and the Sabbath, in his work, The Revelation of the Name of Yahweh to Moses, Perspectives from Judaism, the Pagan Greco-Roman World, and Early Christianity, shows that IAO was always a derivative name based on the Jewish deity and not some non-biblical deity. He's got a long quote from this historian, not going to read it. I just referencing these things to you. You can look into this. Is a great article, by the way, but I highly recommend you go read it if you're interested in this particular history. 7, the next point here. After the Greek rendering of IAO becomes widespread among pagan writers, it is borrowed by the Gnostics and magical practitioners of the 2nd century. Ding, ding, ding. Like they borrowed every other deity's name in the world to try to accomplish their magical and or expansionist goals. It was an explicitly synchronistic system, i.e. just absorbing different things from different cultures and making one mishmash. The mystery religion. And one that often used words that were not understood or even made no sense. Quote, Judaism and the Greek magical papyri, the importance and the popularity of Jewish magic in the Greco-Roman world can be partially gauged by the influence that it apparently exerted on pagan magical practices. One of the more striking examples of this influence is seen in the popularity of the Jewish names for God used in pagan magical procedures. Such names as Yahweh, Sabaoth, Adonai, and Eloi occur frequently in various citations, often in combination, yada, yada, yada. Furthermore, biblical names appear like Adam, Abraham, Moses, and also do the names of angels from Jewish tradition. Yeah, people love like Michael, Gabriel, Metatron, Raphael. I mean, this is a mishmash of stuff. The New Age is all about this kind of stuff. Oh, you got to pray to the Archangel Michael, or pray to, this angel or that angel, or, this is the amulet of Moses, and this is tradition and Kabbalistic nonsense. Moreover, a number of magical names and words end in oth, a typical Semitic ending. Because the bedrock of magical praxis, you have to understand, we'll talk about this in the future section when we talk about the occult. The bedrock of magical praxis, and if you've seen my Masoretic episode, you know what I'm talking about, is Masoretic. It's Masoretic Hebrew. Masoretic Hebrew is a magical alphabet designed to practice Kabbalah. Kabbalah is the mystery religion of the ages. And of course, there's other elements that are combined into it. The mystery religion is a mishmash of lies. But magical praxis, the New Agers are practicing Kabbalah. The New Age movement, Satanism, it's all the secret societies, it's all the same thing, folks. And so a lot of it is based on the Kabbalistic principles. And of course, Kabbalah cannot be divorced from Masoretic Hebrew, which is an important point. Moving on. Several magical papyri exhibit a particularly striking Jewish influence. Of course they do. We looked at that in Masoretic episode. Something is a complex composition entitled Eighth Book of Moses, embodying several earlier documents and traditions. It includes the Key of Moses and another section that begins with the description, the sacred secret of Moses called the Eighth or Holy. All these little traditions of men. The subscriptio of the composition appears in the line 730 as the eighth hidden book of Moses, but the author has supplied an alternate title as well. Quote, in another copy it is written, the hidden book of Moses on the great name, that for everything in which the name of the one who rules all. One ring to rule them all is what these people believe. At the conclusion of the papyrus, lines 1077f, is another subscriptio, the 10th hidden book of Moses. These varied titles indicate that the document has had a very long and complex literary history. The content is predominantly pagan, despite a veneer of Jewish magical and religious traditions. Yeah, this is very common. Another much shorter document is called From the Diadem of Moses. Does the Bible tell you that Moses wore a diadem? No. It is apparently an excerpt from a much larger collection and contains formulas for invisibility and for attracting the love of women. The divine names Yahweh, Sabaoth, remember the Lord of Hosts, and Adonai are part of the incantation of this particular spell. Thus, the Greek magical papyri provide evidence both that Jewish magic was influential upon its pagan counterpart, and that, as in the Old Testament, pagan magic had a profound impact on Jewish magical practices as well. Yeah, they're all cross-pollinating with each other. But that comes after the truth has been revealed. The reason there's counterfeits is because there is a truth. Hopefully you realize that, and you don't let these things sway you. Nowhere is syncretism illustrated more clearly than in the magical and astrological beliefs of the era. In this realm, power takes precedence over personality. Commitment to one deity or fidelity to one cult gives way to rituals of power that work. Thus, many gods and goddesses could be invoked at the same time by one person. Yahweh or Yao could be invoked in the same breath as Artemis and Hecate. Palestinian and diaspora Jews participated in this form of syncretism. Numerous Jewish magical amulets, spells, and astrological documents attest to the prevalence of syncretistic Jewish magic. And we looked at this. We looked at old Masoretic Jewish amulets, the Leningrad Codex, which is the cover of the Masoretic text that we get our Old Testament Bibles from, has a giant magical rune on the front. A giant as above, so below, Star of Remphan, with all kinds of little characters, and it's a magical rune. So if you know what a magical rune is, we certainly covered that. So this is confirming all that. Next, but even when used by the Gnostics, their version of Yahweh was still not always equated with Yahweh, since Yahweh was only considered one of the deities and not even the main one at that. Exactly. It's the heart that matters, folks. The prayers of the wicked the sacrifices of the wicked are an abomination to God. So even though these people are using his name or trying to invoke, God's power, they're not doing anything. God is not going to be summoned by somebody. For them, that's not even the God of the Bible. Because you see how this, I'm going to take a little break here, but you see how this works? If you're actually calling out to the God of the Bible, the true God of the Bible, according to your heart, and you know who you're calling out to, i.e. the sovereign God of the universe, who's the judge of the world, and who you need to repent to because he's going to judge you if you don't. If you believe that he's the only God, then the only possible outcome of that is repentance. Do you understand? The reason these people are deceived is because they don't believe God is the only God. They say, oh, he's one of the gods. Just like the Freemasons believe in the demiurge and there's good and evil and they're both gods. This is all just syncretism and mystery religion stuff. So it doesn't matter that they appropriated the name Yahweh to their magical beliefs several centuries later. It doesn't mean anything. All it means is that the devil has been hard at work deceiving people left and right. So anyway, early accounts of the Gnostic variants include Yahweh in a list as a peer or even as an inferior to others. Just like the pagans, like the Canaanites. You seeing something interesting? But these are post-New Testament and are mostly a hodgepodge cocktail mix of well-known and therefore impressive names for their cause. Irenaeus Against Heresies, chapter 4, account given by the heretics of the formation of Achamoth, origin of the visible world for the disturbances. So Irenaeus documents these pagans, basically, this is Against Heresies in his book 1. I'm not going to read it all, but Irenaeus documents these Gnostics using these appropriations and misappropriating Christ. And of course, the Gnostics had their own false gospel, and Jesus came to teach you how to, advance beyond the matrix and so on. So yeah, they appropriated other religions to their own way of doing things. It's Cain level worship, approaching God the way you think you want to, or the way you think is good, instead of the way God has revealed to be good. Tertullian, same thing. They document these things where people are using Yahweh and appropriating it to their pagan stuff. Origen, same thing. I'm not going to read these things. Next point. Secondary accounts point this out as well, that Yahweh in this literature is not the big God, but an intermediate class deity, except when referring to the Old Testament deity Yahweh. In the Coptic Gnostic, some text, whatever, one of the 7 archons is of some relevance for the present discussion, for the 4th is Yahweh with the face of a dragon who has 7 heads. So again, the Gnostics appropriated these things to their own liking. Of course, remember the Gnostics like Marcion. Marcion wasn't technically a Gnostic, but he was halfway there. He had Gnostic ideas. The Gnostics believed there was an evil God. And of course, if the idea spread like Marcion, that the God of the Old Testament is this evil God, and so other Gnostics were picking up on that, then of course they're going to create their own mythology of, well, Yahweh must be this one of the archons that is in the fleshly realm and the 7th layer of the earth or whatever, all these mythologies. And so the mythology it goes, when you don't have objective truth, the devil has free reign to create endless possibilities of deception. This is exactly, but of course they're all kind of the same deception, really, if you think about it. Nothing new under the sun. And this is what's exactly being documented. And the problem is the people who argue that Yahweh was a pagan deity go to the later sources, go to the pagan sources and say, see, it's a pagan source. Yahweh was a 7-headed dragon, according to these people. Well, what do you mean according to these people? These people are Gnostics. they're totally deceived. I'm not going to trust what they say. I'm going to look at what the Bible says. So this is the problem. This is the problem in logic. Let's see, there's some more stuff here. When Yahweh was related to various pantheons outside of the magical papyri, he is normally equated with the heads of the pantheon, like Zeus or Jupiter, and not with the solar deities, like Helios or Sol. So he couldn't, even the pagans in secondary texts, when they're referring to Yahweh, he's often equated to Zeus or Jupiter, like major gods, like the god, as opposed to solar deities, which is important. So pagans document that as well. Next point. But Yahweh could also be identified with other gods too, such as Dionysius. The theoretician of the identification of the Jewish god with Dionysius is, in the case of the Jewish abhorrence of eating pork, Plutarch. One section of his Questiones Conviviales is devoted to the question who the god of the Jews is. After Plutarch's brother Lamprius has hinted at the possible identity of Dionysius with Adonis and connected the Jews' dislike of the pig with the fact that Adonis is said to have been slain by the boar, the Athenian Moragenes embarks upon a long digression in which he identifies the Jewish worship with the cult of Dionysius. So again, what's going on here? The pagans are making myths to try to fit the Jewish worldview into their pantheon. Who is this God that we need to figure out, the Jewish God? Well, the Jews don't like pork, and we know that Adonis was slayed by a boar, so it has to be, therefore, that the Jewish God is Dionysius, which relates to the boar somehow, I forget. But anyway, do you see how this works? And of course, people create mythologies like in a snap. And there's nothing new under the sun. Even before the internet, people were making all kinds of viral mistakes. 12. And even in the two mentions that I can find where Yahweh is connected with the solar deity Helios, the passages actually do not make the connection one of identity. Yahweh in those passages seems to incorporate Helios along with other gods at the same time. This shows that Yahweh was not a solar deity in even those post-New Testament pagan writings. The major passage is the Oracle of Claris, and the analysis of the passage shows that Yahweh is subsumed Helios, meaning, took over his qualities. And he cites this pagan, Gnostic text here to prove it. The only other quasi-early connection I can find between Yahweh and Helios also connects wider than just Helios and also broadens the range of the names beyond Yahweh. Not much can be shown from this amulet, therefore. Quote, for other magical texts containing the divine name Yahweh, we see yada yada, the various papyruses. The title Yahweh also occurs, my eye is itchy, on several amulets. A bloodstone amulet in the British Museum depicts Helios and Selene with this inscription, Yahweh Sabaoth Abraxas, the existent one. Again, this is no different today. People use, like the New Age and tarot cards, use the Masoretic tetragrammaton to do their divination. On the reverse, that was pretty much on the reverse, that inscription. As we get further into quasi-magical name-citing texts, we find more use of Yahweh as a magical term and as a non-Jewish specialist sub-deity, i.e. there is supposedly a Gnostic amulet that portrays Yahweh as a man with snake legs. And the prayer of Jacob in 2nd and 4th century AD might indicate that Yahweh was connected with the sun, but if so, it says that the Jewish God sits on top of him. This is the text. You who sit upon the mountain of holy Sinaios, you who sit upon the sea, you who sit upon the serpent gods, the God who sits upon the sun, Yahweh, God Ebeoth, Abrahayoth, Sabaoth, Adonai, Asta, the Lord of all things. This is not a text in the Bible. It's called the Prayer of Jacob. It's just probably a Gnostic text. Charles Worth points out that the critical line is very important, is very corrupt, and we cannot tell if, number one, God is called Yahweh and he sits upon the sun, right? Because this is the God who sits upon the sun, Yahweh. The inflection of this is not clear. Like upon Sinai, sea is the serpent gods, or number two possibility, God sits upon the sun, which is named Yahweh. So is there distinguishing between the sun being Yahweh, like a god that the actual God sits upon, or is God's name Yao that he sits upon the sun? It's not clear. But in either case, we do not have the Jewish God identified with the solar deity Yao, period. Because again, this is not referring to Yahweh and identifying it with the sun. Summary. Boy, quite the article. The name Yahweh was in use over 1,000 years before the name Yao begins to show up. In the ancient Greek, pre-Christian translations of the Hebrew Bible, the name of God was not rendered as Yao. It was used just in the square script of the Aramaic, the transitionary form that the Hebrews were starting to write in initially. And then you had a few, the first century Yao, and then eventually it just became Kyrios. Again, lost in translation, just like with the Hebrew of the original pronunciation. Late in biblical history, Yao begins to surface as a rendering of the name Yahweh, but it is always known to be only about Yahweh. There is no other Yao which is connected to the Jewish God by people who are using this term. Pagan historical and literary writers use Yao as the name for the Jewish God and sometimes connect him with the highest deity in their respective pantheons. So again, the pagans latched onto it and had their own stories about it. And this is how the confusion is created. And of course, today you have people believing the pagans instead of the word of God. This is the problem. Yahweh is never equated with or identified as being the respective solar deities, ever. After the New Testament, we begin to see, odd uses of the word Yao, sometimes as a magical name derived from the Jewish God, or as an inferior Gnostic deity. This was not unique to Yahweh, since all deities and currency were also used in this way in such magical spells. Yeah, so it's not like it was just being done to God's name. They were doing it to Zeus, they didn't care. It's a mystery religion. They don't have an objective truth. So for them, it's, let's put a little Jupiter in there. Let's do the Jewish God, Yao. Oh, how about, Buddha? We can put that in there. We have anything goes, go with the flow type of thing. Make your own spiritual buffet. There is no antecedent solar deity that is the origination of the word content of Yahweh. Absolutely, because Yahweh is an extremely old word. It goes back to when it was written, the Exodus, because Moses wrote the Pentateuch, and Moses was the one who contacted Yahweh, or I should say Yahweh contacted Moses. So, my goodness, that was quite the article, but you never know. You might run into somebody that says, well, IAO was a solar deity. See, there's now you have a very good rebuttal to it. And of course, you have a link to that article in the references. Conclusion. This article proves a few things. It proves that IAO usage was first, the first usage was strictly for Yahweh. That's number one. And that was long before Gnosticism. It proves that the enemy hijacked the sacred name, as usual, to create all kinds of lies and counterfeits and misinformation. Nothing new under the sun. It also proves, very interestingly, that's why I decided to highlight it for you, it is consistent with our pronunciation of Yahweh. Yao, iota, alpha, omega, is consistent with Yahweh that we discerned from all those other sources. So that is part of the archaeological evidence that we reviewed. Let's review really quick. The first one was reaffirmed that the Bible is the Word of God. We looked at that. Look at the archaeological evidence. We looked at history. We looked at Ketef Hinnom scrolls with the various archaeological things from the Exodus, the surrounding data with Yao and how that name was used in Greek, and now the biblical evidence, number 3. Well, in Genesis 2, verse 4, it says, Yahweh. These are the generations of the heavens and the earth when they were created in the day that Yahweh God made the earth and the heavens. First place that Yahweh is mentioned in Genesis 2. So this statement links Genesis 2 with Genesis 1, because Genesis 2 does not tell you anything about creating the earth and the heavens. Genesis 1 does, meaning these two are linked. But of course, remember, there were no chapter marks in the original text. When Jesus was around, there were no chapter marks. So people say, oh, see, Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, they're separate. They're not. What do you mean they're separate? Nobody who ever interacted with the Bible during Jesus' time or the Old Testament time would have ever thought that Genesis 1 and 2 were separate books. No. Why would they think such a thing? Or separate chapters or separate creation accounts? Nonsense. So Yahweh is first mentioned in Genesis 2. Moses wrote the Pentateuch, and we know that Moses received the name from God. So the first time that Yahweh is mentioned in the Bible by name He's mentioned as God and the creator. Again, I've talked about the Genesis 1 and 2 separate thing being a psyop. If you want to dig deeper into that, I have a whole video in my debunk section. Check it out. I forget the exact title of it, but it's two creations, yada, yada, two creations, Oh, I'm just blanking out on the name, but it's two creations and some other titles and the gap theory and so on and so forth. Check it out because that needs to be expanded upon, of course, when you're talking about Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. And a lot of people, again, this stuff just links to so many deceptions. Serpent seed, Genesis 1 and 2 creations, pre-cosmic rebellion with Satan. It's like, literally, once you get into this maze, you can go through all the deceptions, I feel like. Anyway, John 5, verse 46 to 47, remember that Jesus affirms that Moses wrote the Pentateuch. For if you believe Moses, you would believe me, for he wrote of me. So, therefore, Yahweh predates Canaan and the flood and cannot be a pagan deity because Moses wrote that Yahweh is the creator before all things were created. And Moses, at the very least, wrote that down in the 15th century BC, which was before Canaan and the Israelites interacted with Canaanites. So these articles that are secular are wrong. Yahweh, according to the first-hand witness, i.e. Moses, is the one who created the world. If you don't believe that, then you cannot possibly come to a correct conclusion about who God is. Because Jesus reaffirmed Moses' authorship, and Jesus claimed to be Yahweh. So who do you believe? Do you believe the testimony of God, both in the Old Testament and the New Testament, and his witnesses, Moses? Or do you believe the pagans and the secular sources? Remember that pagan cultures exaggerated everything. And they had every reason to exaggerate, like the Egyptians, the Assyrians, the Greeks. Mythologies, exaggerating battles and various victories, or omitting failures. And this is, of course, why the Bible is different. Because the tradition of passing information down from scribe to scribe, they were very picky about keeping the information correct. And this is why the Bible's different from pagan sources. Pagans were the opposite. Every new generation came along, they added some new mythology that seemed cool. And this is why the pagans have half-truth. They have something there that points to the truth. And of course, it can be used to see, I can see how the pagans are seeing it. But you have to maintain the Bible as your primary lens, and then you can see the truth. The problem is these people look at the pagans as the primary lens, and they're trying to interpret the Bible through pagan ideas and Gnostic ideas. All the pagan cultures, for example, all the pagan cultures have stories of the flood, but they have a lot of added mythology. Today, people, for example, believe the Epic of Gilgamesh because it's older than the Bible, like age-wise, but that doesn't mean that it's the truth just because it's older. The Epic of Gilgamesh was written by pagans, and it's a story of the flood, and of course, every culture in ancient times has a story of the flood. Why? Because the flood happened. That tells you that the flood happened. However, there's a lot of witnesses, and which of those witnesses are you going to believe? Well, the most trustworthy witness is God, and revealing to you everything that you need to know in the Holy Scriptures. So we have that on our advantage because we have the Spirit of God and we have the Scriptures, but these people that don't have that, they're lost in the weeds. They don't know what is objective truth, and so, of course, they're very easily deceived. Many people have this argument of Yahweh is a pagan god. Yahweh is just a tribal deity because they respect and value pagan sources as objective truth rather than valuing the Bible as the truth. They say, look, the Epic of Gilgamesh is older than the Bible, so therefore the Bible got it from the Epic of Gilgamesh. That's a non sequitur. That's a non-follow. It doesn't follow that the Bible got the story of the flood from the Epic of Gilgamesh. What if they're both describing the same event? The Bible was written a little later. They're different. What's different about the Bible? Well, the Bible is, we have prophecy, we have archaeology, et cetera, et cetera. The Bible is the Word of God. Go back to point number one. Once you prove that, you say, okay, well, then the Bible's the one to be the one to trust, not the Epic of Gilgamesh. The Epic of Gilgamesh could be an interesting thing to read and say, okay, there's some parallels here. That's really interesting. But I'm not going to take the Epic of Gilgamesh as primary evidence, which is very important. But these people who hang on to pagan sources, if you challenge them with the Bible, they're going to say, well, the Bible's corrupted, even though they cite from the Bible, which is, you can't have it both ways, folks. Either you reject the Bible and you say it's been corrupted or it's not true or the Israelites just made it to promote their national identity or whatever other excuse you want to promote. Okay, great. If you say that, then you cannot cite from the Bible as authoritative. You notice all these sites, even the secular ones, they're saying, oh, it says so in Deuteronomy. Well, wait a minute. If you don't believe the Bible is the Word of God, how can you cite from it? You don't know if the thing you're citing is actually the actual way that it was written. Maybe it's totally made up in, relatively recently. How do you know that? How do you know that what you're citing is true? And this is the conundrum that these people get into. They don't realize that they're contradicting themselves. You can't have it both ways. If you reject the Bible as true, then you cannot cite from the Bible because you don't know if what you're citing is true. If you accept the Bible, then the Bible refutes this position clearly, because the first time that people, or I should say this way, the first time Yahweh shows up is creation of the world, meaning he's the creator, he existed before the world. Then before the flood, people were calling on the name of Yahweh, I believe in Genesis 4. And of course, Moses was a first-hand witness to Yahweh, and Moses basically wrote down all these things in 1400 BC. We have archaeological evidence of it. Abraham also had interactions with Yahweh. We'll look at that in a future section. So if you take the Bible's words as testimony, then the Bible refutes these positions very clearly. So what really happened? How do we refute this? Well, again, you have those 3 points I talked about. Focus on the Bible as the Word of God. Prove that. Archaeological evidence, and biblical evidence, which we all just covered. Now, to respond to this and to create a narrative of what actually happened, you have to put all this together. It's important to understand that the biblical and historical context come together in a way that's very different than what these secular sources are saying. They're looking at history, and there is history, but they're interpreting it wrong because they have the wrong lens. The Old Testament is full of apostasy of the Israelites, while God is revealing his plan of salvation and working it through his elect. Constant apostasy. The pagan forces are constantly surrounding God's people. It's this constant, attack and force that God consistently has chosen to be in the middle of the wolves so he can demonstrate his power. Just like how Jesus took the apostles to the most pagan place in their vicinity, which was Mount Hermon, Capernaum. Was it Capernaum? No, it was Caesarea Philippi. He took them to Caesarea Philippi, where there were just all kinds of horrendously pagan things going on. Literally proclaiming the kingdom in the middle of the kingdom of darkness. This is God's style, because he shows his power by being surrounded by the enemy. And that's the whole point. And so that's been also the story of the Old Testament. Of course, that also results in the fact that there are elect and reprobate. There are people that didn't get saved and given the ability to believe in God, and they went and apostatized, and they got judged for it. But either way, there's this history of pagans surrounding God's people, and they're interacting, and some fall away, some stay faithful, and it's just constant happening. Even today, look around you. Look around you. There's the superposition of the true church and the counterfeit church, which has been around since the beginning, really, even before Constantine legalized Christianity and Catholicism came around. You had the counterfeit church with counterfeit apostles, people like Marcion. The devil was never wasted a minute to create a counterfeit. You've always had this superposition. And if you understand this, then it gives you the context to explain what's actually happening here. We're going to read a couple articles to understand even more how these influences of the superposition of paganism and God's people influence the development of their understanding, and also history, looking back on it and saying, gosh, what actually happened here? Did these people import Yahweh from the pagans? Or was there something more complex going on, which we have to think about? Well, the first article is from Michael Heiser, which is, of course, passed away now, but this is Two Powers in Heaven. And you have to understand what's going on here. 25 years ago, rabbinical scholar Alan Segal produced what is still the major work on the idea of two powers in heaven in Jewish thought. Segal argued that the two powers idea was not deemed heretical in Jewish theology until the 2nd century CE. I wonder why. He carefully traced the roots of the teaching back to the Second Temple era. Segal was also able to establish the idea's antecedents were in the Hebrew Bible, especially passages like Daniel 7:9, Exodus 23, and Exodus 15. However, he was unable to discern any coherent religious framework from which these passages and others were conceptually derived. Persian dualism was unacceptable as an explanation since neither of the two powers in heaven were evil. Very important. The Jews believed in two powers in heaven, but neither of the powers were evil. They were good and they were God. That's because God exists in plurality. You had the angel of Yahweh and Yahweh that you couldn't see. Segal speculated that divine warrior imagery of the broader ancient Near East likely had some relationship. In my dissertation, I argued that Segal's instincts were correct. My own work bridges the gap between his book and the Hebrew Bible understood in its Canaanite religious context. Now again, I don't agree with everything Michael Heiser has to say, but this is just to paint a picture of what's actually going on, which is the interaction of God's people and paganism and the forces of darkness constantly being right next up to each other. I suggest that the original model for the two powers idea was the role of the vice-regent of the divine council. The paradigm of the high sovereign God, El, who rules heaven and earth through the agency of a second appointed God, Baal, became part of the Israelite religion, albeit with some modification. For the Orthodox Israelite, Yahweh was both sovereign and vice-regent, occupying both slots, as it were, at the head of the divine council. The binitarian portrayal of Yahweh in the Hebrew Bible was motivated by this belief. The ancient Israelite knew two Yahwehs, one invisible, a spirit, and the other visible, often in human form. The two Yahwehs at times appear together in the text, at sometimes being distinguished, at other times being not. Yeah, this is why the only conclusion you can come to is a plurality of God. Because sometimes God is speaking, Yahweh is speaking, and then he speaks in the third person about himself. It's like, what's going on here? Well, you're dealing with a consciousness that is beyond comprehension is what's happening, being revealed to you. Early Judaism understood this portrayal and its rationale. There was no sense of violation of monotheism since either figure was indeed Yahweh. There was no second distinct God running the affairs of the cosmos. During the Second Temple period, Jewish theologians and writers speculated on the identity of the second Yahweh. Guesses ranged from divinized humans from the stories of the Hebrew Bible to exalted angels. This is now the tradition part of the rabbinic system. And they also had a whole thing with the Word, which again, I point you to my, I think number 12 in my Trinity series, the Word in the name, good stuff there. But of course, that's why John says the Word became flesh. He's playing off of these traditions so that he said, look, it's here now. The Word is here. He's here. These speculations were not considered unorthodox. That acceptance changed when certain Jews, the early Christians, connected Jesus with this Orthodox Jewish idea, i.e. John 1. This explains why these Jews, the first converts to following Jesus Christ, could simultaneously worship the God of Israel and Jesus, and yet refuse to acknowledge any other God. Jesus was the incarnate second Yahweh. In response, as Segal's works demonstrated, Judaism pronounced the two powers teaching a heresy sometime in the 2nd century AD. So that's something to remember, that the Jews, for several centuries, believed in a plurality of God. Now they were, as time went on, they had several theories as to who the second Yahweh was. But Yahweh, you could be a Jew and believe in two Yahwehs without having to be a polytheist, because both Yahwehs were Yahweh, and there was no cognitive dissonance there. They were able to entertain the mystery of a being existing in plurality. Whereas today, people try to fit that into a box because they can't handle it. But this is what the Jews believed in. And of course, as they conquered the Canaanites, they got various ideas of how to describe Yahweh and the second Yahweh. Oh, that's kind of how the Canaanites had their pantheon. But God is really the regent. God is the regent. And he's also the vice-regent because he has the angel of Yahweh who's also Yahweh. There's a different way of thinking, folks. And of course, when you don't have a way of describing things, like for example, English took a lot of words from French. A lot of words from French and German. And so it's appropriation, but it doesn't mean the same thing. It doesn't mean that they took those gods from the Canaanites. And you'll see more evidence of that later. But this is This is a book, Israelite Religions, if I can get it to somehow display. Well, okay, so it seems that I can't get this to display the page that I was looking for. So you can look this up, maybe an Internet Archive, or if you have a library nearby, you can look it up. It's titled Israelite Religions, an Archaeological and Biblical Survey. The point that I was trying to make with this is that basically the calf was associated with Baal worship, and the author is Richard S. Hess, and so he describes how the calf in paganism was related to Baal, and we'll talk about some of those things as well later. This is from Liberty University, digitalcommons.com.edu. God Among the Gods, an analysis of the function of Yahweh in the divine council of Deuteronomy 32 and Psalm 82. Of course, this is secular, a little more secular, but it says, the importance of the Ugaritic text discovered in 1929 to ancient Near Eastern and biblical studies is one of constant debate. Because a lot of people will say, well, the Ugaritic text, which again, they're older texts, and they say, see, it describes Yahweh as a pagan deity, is one of the pagan deities. Well, what does that mean? Does that mean the Israelites took it from previous cultures? Well, not so fast. The Ugaritic texts offer a window into the cosmology that shaped the ancient Near East and Semitic religions. One of the profound concepts is the idea of a divine council and its function of maintaining order in the cosmos. There's some truth to this, folks. Yahweh is the supreme God. Originally, he apportioned these nations to these Elohim, and they rebelled. And of course, that was all by design so that he could demonstrate his power as the supreme spiritual being. So people knew various shades of the truth, but the Bible tells you what the truth really is. Over this council sits a high God identified as El in the Ugaritic texts, whose divine function is to maintain order in the divine realm as well as on earth. Due to Ugarit's involvement in the ancient world and the text representation of Canaanite cosmology, scholars have argued that the Ugaritic pantheon is evidenced in the Hebrew Bible, where Yahweh appears in conjunction with other divine beings. Drawing on imagery from both the Ugaritic and Hebrew texts, scholars argue that Yahweh was not originally the high God of Israel, and that the idea of Yahweh alone was a progression throughout the biblical record. So the Bible tells you it's always been Yahweh alone for the elect, the faithful. The devil tells you, no, it's a progression. Always the opposite. Notice that right away. However, there are scholars who understand the divine council motif as a common image among all ancient Semitic peoples. And while the biblical writers use the imagery of divine council, they do not adopt the theology. True. This is the point. The questions that arise are, do the Hebrew scriptures allow for Ugaritic parallelism? Is the divine council in the Hebrew scriptures an import from Ugarit, meaning did they get it from these people, or was it original? And if so, what is the function of Yahweh in these council settings? To answer these questions, this thesis explores the views and responses presented by scholars who analyze two key passages in the debate where the Yahweh El polemic is suggested, i.e. Deuteronomy 32, 8 verse 9, and Psalm 82. Psalm 82, I don't really see the connection there, but Deuteronomy 32, 8, 9, where he apportions the nations. We're going to break this down because it's so taken out of context. This is from Got Questions. What is Ugaritic and what does it have to do with the Bible? Ugaritic was an ancient language spoken in the city of Ugarit on the Mediterranean coast of Syria, contemporaneously with many of the events in the Old Testament. What we have learned from the excavations of the city and from the language, a Semitic language somewhat similar to ancient Hebrew, has given us a clearer understanding of some aspects of Canaanite culture and worship, and has also helped us to understand some words in ancient Hebrew that have been difficult to translate. Because the Old Testament is an ancient book far removed from modern language and culture, there are many things that the original hearers would have assumed or understood that are lost to us. Our modern translations are very good, but more knowledge about ancient cultures will give us a clear understanding of the meaning of the text. We don't mean to say that the text of Scripture is unintelligible without extensive knowledge of ancient cultures or languages, but this knowledge does help fill out the picture. Perhaps it might be compared to watching a movie on a color television instead of a black and white set. In 1928, a farmer in Syria was plowing his field when he uncovered an ancient tomb. He found some valuables in it, which he sold. Eventually, word leaked out about the find, and the site, now called Ras Shamra, was properly excavated, revealing the ancient city of Ugarit. Among the items uncovered were cuneiform tablets in a Semitic language similar to Hebrew. Using principles of translation and comparing it to Hebrew, scholars were eventually able to decipher the tablets, resulting in one of the world's greatest literary finds. And it is a good find. And of course, again, if you use the Bible as your lens, then you can really take from these things and enrich your understanding. But if you don't, then you'll go the way of the wind. That's the test. The majority of the tablets contain poetry, and much of the poetry contains myths about the primary god of the city, Baal. This literature reveals beliefs about Baal and practices for his worship. When comparing the worship poetry of Ugarit with Hebrew Psalms, we find that there are often striking similarities. The people of Ugarit often ascribed to Baal what the people of Israel ascribed to Yahweh. For example, Ugaritic literature reveals that Baal was thought to be the god of the thunders and storms. But Psalm 29 attributes the storm-making to God, as if David is saying, quote, "You Canaanite peoples ascribe this power to Baal, but we know that it really actually belongs to Yahweh who controls the storm." The biblical psalms were thus more than isolated songs of praise, but they may have very well been polemic as well. Very important that you understand that there's an element of polemics, i.e., kind of attacking or basically against a position against these pagan cultures, with all of the times where these psalms and other places are attributing pagan mythology or pagan qualities to God. And I'm not saying that God is a pagan God, but like controlling the storms. Well, did Baal control the storms, or did God control? Well, of course, God is the one who controls the storms. And the point that the psalms are making are first praising God because he controls the storms, he controls all things, and also a way to proclaim God's glory, that he's the true God. He's the one that you guys need to worship. You're worshiping the wrong God. You think Baal controls the storms? Well, you're wrong. That's the element that's going on here. And of course, if you don't see that, all you see is, oh, well, David just took it from the Canaanites. So there you go. They imported the Canaanite religion into Israel, which is wrong. The discovery of Ugaritic helps us better understand the incident with Elijah on Mount Carmel. King Ahab and the people had been worshiping Baal. Remember, parallel cultures, God's people, counterfeits, right up and against each other throughout history. But the false god could not produce rain for the land. There had been no rain for 3 years, as Elijah the prophet of Yahweh had declared. Elijah's pronouncement had contained an implied showdown between Baal and Yahweh. On Mount Carmel, Yahweh answered by fire, probably lightning in some way, to burn up Elijah's sacrifice and even the stones of the altar, showing himself sovereign over Baal's realm. Then, only after the prophets of Baal had been killed, did God send rain. We can understand the story without knowing anything about Baal except he was a rival god. But the background information gleaned from the Ugaritic poetry fills out our understanding and how the people of Israel may have felt about this event. There are some places in the Old Testament where translators are unclear about the best meaning of certain words. Comparison of Hebrew to Ugaritic sometimes gives more context to these words and allows us to gain a clear understanding of the meaning. For example, Amos 1 verse 1 says that Amos is described as one of the shepherds of Tekoa. The Hebrew word for shepherd is not the one normally used, and there was some uncertainty among translators about the precise meaning of the term. In Ugaritic, the equivalent word means manager or owner of large herds or sheep. Therefore, Amos was probably not just some poor shepherd or uneducated dirt farmer, as he's often portrayed in sermons. He was probably a well-to-do businessman. There's nothing here that changes the meaning of the text, but it does give us a greater insight into who Amos was. When he obeyed the Lord and went into the northern kingdom to preach, he may have given up or at least risked a significant livelihood. And when Amos decrees the social injustice in Israel, he's doing it as one of the haves, i.e. one of the people who's successful, not one of the have-nots. In Judges 5 verse 17, the tribe of Dan is chided for not coming to help Deborah and Barak defeat the Amalekites. Quote, "And Dan, why did he linger by the ships?" This rhetorical question is somewhat mystifying, as Dan did not have any territory by the sea and was not known for using ships. By comparison with Ugaritic, we find that the word translated ships can also mean to be at ease. Again, do you remember the pronunciation issues that we have because of the loss of pronunciation over the centuries? These older texts can help to delineate maybe how are these words pronounced, because then once it's pronounced differently, oh, that's a whole different meaning. So that's the point being discussed here. So it makes more sense in the context to translate the phrase this way. And Dan, why did he linger at ease? Which makes total sense. Or as the NLT puts it, why did Dan stay home? Gosh, no, NLT, don't quote NLT. The basic meaning is not changed. Dan did not come to the aid of Israel when needed, but the circumstances are clarified. Dan remained at ease, not in ships. The discovery of Ugaritic helps us to better understand the culture and language of the Old Testament. It does not change the essential meaning of any text of Scripture, but it can give it more color. And that's the way you need to see these things. Not as proof that the Israelites imported Yahweh from these pagan sources, and there you go, he's a pagan god. I think I have one more. This is again from the Tetragrammaton, but going back to these Amalekites, I think was the issue. Yeah, this is Yahweh in the Tetragrammaton, but this is another thing. The element Yahweh, YHWH, Yahweh, is found in the Amorite personal names, like Yahweh Dagon or Yahweh Dagon, commonly denoted as the semantic equivalent of the Akkadian version. The latter refers to one existing, which in the context of deities can also refer to one's eternal existence, which aligns with the Bible verse of Exodus 33:15, and views that Eye Asher can mean I am the existing one. It also explains the ease of Israelites applying the olam, or everlasting, epithet from El to Yahweh. But J. Philip Hyatt believes it is more likely that Yahweh refers to a God creating and sustaining the life of a newborn child rather than the universe. This conception of God was more popular among the ancient Near Easterners because they were very fertility, cult-based. But eventually the Israelites removed the association of Yahweh to any human ancestor and combined it with other elements, i.e. Yahweh Sabaoth, like the Lord of Hosts. Hillel ben Sasson states that there is insufficient evidence for the Amorites using Yahweh to refer to a god. But he argues that it mirrors other theophoric names, like Eliyashu or Yirmayahu, where God is in a name, and that Yahweh, or more accurately Yahweh, Y-A-W-I, derives from the root word He, Vav, and Yod in Pa'al, which means he will be. So why did I mention this to you? I mentioned this to you because there's a lot of cross-pollination between these cultures. So let's put this together. In my Berean video, I say that when you see a contradiction or a challenge or something that you're not comfortable with, it's an opportunity. It's an opportunity for you to get deeper in your studies and to understand what's going on and to have a deeper appreciation of the Bible. It's also an opportunity to fail. And I hope that you don't fail. So watch that video, get edified, get tools, and learn to build a case, endure cognitive dissonance, look at multiple sources of reference so that you pass the test. Because the people that don't pass the test are the ones that I cited to you in the beginning of this presentation with their comments. Those people run into this opportunity to get to know God better and be sure of God's word, and they fail because they listen to the devil and their own flesh. So if we hold Scripture in the highest possible view, i.e. we trust God's word, and we don't do what Adam and Eve did in the beginning, which is a test for all of us in this day and age, then we will succeed. Because once you hold that as the view, as the highest possible view, then you are motivated to reconcile this in the right direction, as opposed to reconciling it in the wrong direction. That's the point. The Bible says that Yahweh rides on the clouds and goes to battle. Pagans also had their false gods and were judged by Yahweh through many military campaigns. There were also times when the Israelites apostatized and lost, and Yahweh let them lose. And so there was just this constant interaction of God's people with the forces of darkness. And of course, throughout this time, there were many myths that were being formed. The Israelites became known for their God by the other tribes around them. And of course, the word spread quickly, especially after the Exodus and what Yahweh did in Egypt and so on and so forth. You'll see in the biblical text proof of that. As a result, what happens as a result? Well, as a result of God demonstrating his greatness through the Israelites and through all these conquests, all these other tribes had to fit Yahweh into their polytheistic scheme. Kind of like, remember, the Greeks trying to figure out, well, who is the god of the Jews? Is it Dionysius? Well, that makes sense because Adonis was killed by a boar and they hate pig and so on. It's just in the same way that the Greeks were trying to figure out who the god of the Jews was according to their pantheon, which of course is a false equivalence, but anyway, the same way these pagans, like the Canaanites and everybody else, was trying to figure out, where does this Yahweh belong? Because again, Yahweh didn't reveal himself to those people. They weren't chosen to bring about the Messiah. So they didn't have an intimate relationship with God. But they knew Yahweh existed. This is the point. And so they had to fit him into their universe of various pantheons and schemes. Remember also that God apportioned the nations to divine beings, and they rebelled. I talk about this in my Nephilim episode. And of course, this was all by design so that God could display his power as the greatest Elohim, as the creator, as the greatest spirit, through a tiny, tiny people. In Deuteronomy 7, verse 7 through 10, it says, "It was not because you were more in number than any other people that Yahweh set his love on you and chose you. For you were the fewest of all peoples, but it is because Yahweh loves you and is keeping the oath that he swore to your fathers, that Yahweh has brought you out with a mighty hand and redeemed you from the house of slavery, from the hand of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. Know therefore that Yahweh your God is God, the faithful God who keeps covenant and steadfast love with those who love him and keep his commandments to 1,000 generations, and repays to their face those who hate him by destroying them. He will not be slack with the one who hates him. He will repay him to his face." Why? Because Yahweh's bloodthirsty? No, because Yahweh is the judge of the earth. And if you reject Yahweh, you're rejecting life. Therefore, you must be destroyed. That's the only possible outcome. If you're going to rebel to the source of life and moral truth and goodness, then yeah, you will be destroyed. Yahweh's laws are good. Do not kill, do not cheat, do not steal, do not bear false witness. These are the pillars of society. So if you rebel against that, then you're rebelling against life and you're destroyed. Now in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 27, it says, "God chose what is foolish in the world to shame the wise. God chose what is weak in the world to shame the strong." And this is exactly God's style. God picks something that seems so weak and foolish and, just impossible, and just reveals his glory through it and shames the wise. And this is exactly what happened with the Israelites. The Israelites were nobodies. They were the tiniest groups of people. And through them, he conquered all of these rebellious tribes that were listening to their false gods. And again, there's a spiritual dynamic there. I talk about it in the Nephilim episode with the Feast of Sukkot and the 70 bulls and so on and so forth. Yes, there were 70 Elohim, apparently. The watchers, the governors, the spiritual governors that God had apportioned the nations to. Daniel talks about many princes and the prince of Persia and so on and so forth. And so there's something there. I think that Heiser goes into the divine council a little way too much, but there is something there that God has, for example, Michael, who's one of the chief princes. That's in the Bible. That's in Daniel. There is something that God is the Most High. There's a hierarchy of principalities. There's maybe lesser angels that communicate with humanity. They're watchers. Some of these rebelled and had affairs with women. However many questions that brings up for you, watch my Nephilim episode. And there's humanity. So there is a profound hierarchy. We're not meant to get lost in the hierarchy. But nevertheless, it exists. And you see hints of it here and there. And so the point is that these things were meant to happen. They were designed to happen so that God could demonstrate his power by conquering these rebellious Elohim and conquering these powers and showing who is the true God and who is the true spirit. Also important, besides the constant interaction with paganism that I just described, where you have these constant military campaigns and sometimes there's intermarrying and all this stuff that's going on, Israel apostatized many times. Apostate Israelites appropriated pagan practices and beliefs to the worship of Yahweh. It's no different than today's Catholic Church, where you worship Jesus through a pagan temple, where there's a sacrifice being offered, and sun and the moon, and adoration of the mother, the divine mother, the queen of heaven. This is no different, folks. This is baptized paganism, and I talk about it quite a bit. But here's a few examples of this happening even in antiquity, because there's nothing new under the sun. Exodus 32, 1 through 6, the golden calf. When the people saw that Moses delayed to come down from the mountain, the people gathered themselves together to Aaron and said to him, "Up, make us gods who shall go before us." This is a translation error. We'll come back to this, but just keep that in mind. As for this Moses, the man who brought us up out of the land of Egypt, we do not know what has become of him. So Aaron said to them, take off the rings of gold that are in the ears of your wives, your sons and your daughters, and bring them to me. So the people took off their earrings, they brought them to Aaron. He received the gold from their hand and fashioned it with a graving tool into a golden calf. And they said, these are your gods, O Israel. Again, this is a mistranslation. It's not, oh gods, this is your God, i.e. they're worshiping God as Yahweh. Or I should say they're worshiping the calf as Yahweh. And this is what my point is, that Baal and the calf, they were mixing things up. And this is the problem that you see consistently through history. O Israel, who brought you out of the land of Egypt. So this is Elohim, but it's not meant to be gods, it's meant to be God. When Aaron saw this, he built an altar before it, and Aaron made a proclamation and said, tomorrow shall be a feast to Yahweh. This is how you know that this is a translation error. In Exodus 32:4. It's not gods. The word Elohim there is not referring to gods, little gods, judges, whatever else, angels. It's referring to God, the royal we, the plural of the singular, Elohim, as in the God. This is your God, O Israel, who brought you out of the land of Egypt. Tomorrow shall be a feast to Yahweh. So what are they doing here? Moses is gone. They're freaking out. They don't have any patience. They don't have Fennec fox ears. And they say, oh, okay, well, let's build a God and worship it as our God, Yahweh. Do you see the confusion going on here? No discernment whatsoever. And this has been the theme from the very beginning, folks. From the very beginning. Joshua, what is this? Joshua, did I highlight? Yeah, Joshua 24, 25 through 27. Let's see where we at. 25, 24, 25. Here it is. So Joshua made a covenant with the people that day and put in place statutes and rules for them at Shechem. And Joshua wrote these words in the book of the law of God. And he took a large stone and set up there under the terebinth that was by the sanctuary of Yahweh. And Joshua said to the people, behold, this stone shall be a witness against us, for it has heard all the words of Yahweh that he spoke to us. Therefore it shall be a witness against you, lest you deal falsely with your God. So Joshua, by the way, who worshipped the angel of Yahweh and is proclaiming Yahweh, created a stone as a witness stone of the covenant. Keep that in mind. The witness stone has to do with Yahweh. And this, by the way, has been found. You can look it up on Answers in Genesis either. Expedition Bible on YouTube. Recently, as of the time of this video, released a video on them finding the witness stone. That, the next point of this, was appropriated by apostate Israelites for pagan worship. This is in Judges 9, verses 1 through 6. Let's go to it. Abimelech's conspiracy. Now Abimelech the son of Jerubbaal went to Shechem to his mother's relatives and said to them and to the whole clan of his mother's family, say in the ears of all the leaders of the Shechem, which is better for you, that all 70 of the sons of Jerubbaal rule over you, or that one rule over you? Remember also that I am your bone and your flesh. And his mother's relatives spoke all these words on his behalf in the ears of all the leaders of Shechem, and their hearts inclined to follow Abimelech, for they said, he is our brother. And they gave him 70 pieces of silver out of the house of Baal-berith. Now, Baal-berith this is an interesting point here, because Baal-berith is a place where it was a pagan practice going on. And they found the stone there, the Joshua's stone, and this was being appropriated for pagan practice and pagan temple sacrifices, with which Abimelech hired worthless and reckless fellows who followed him. And he went to his father's house at Ophrah and killed his brothers, the sons of Jerubbaal, 17 men on one stone, i.e. probably maybe the stone in question, who knows. But Jotham, the youngest son of Jerubbaal, was left, for he hid himself. And all the leaders of Shechem came together at Beth Millo, and they went and made Abimelech king by the oak of the pillar at Shechem. Where Abimelech was made king was by the oak, and this is also where the stone was. And I suggest you, if you want more archaeological evidence for that, look in the one I cited with the Expedition Bible, the Joshua's stone, witness stone. But there's some other things to read here. This is a biblical archaeology, the Shiloh excavation from biblicalarchaeology.org. Temple at Baal-berith. Let's learn about the temple at Baal-berith. References to the temple of Baal-berith, Beth Milo, temple of their god, Tower of Shechem, temple of El-berith, all appear to be the same structure at Shechem. Yada, 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 various citations. Berith is the Hebrew word for covenant. So Baal-berith is Lord of the covenant. So keep that in mind. So the temple was for Baal of the covenant. A large fortress temple discovered on the Acropolis of Shechem has been identified as the Temple of Judges 9, which I just read to you. It was constructed in the 17th century BC and lasted until the destruction of the city by Abimelech in the 12th century BC. The largest temple yet found in Canaan, it measures 70 by 86 feet and has foundations 17 feet thick that supported a multi-storied superstructure of mud bricks and timber. On the east, 2 towers containing stairwells to the upper stories flanked the entrance. Inside, the 2 rows of columns, 3 in each row, divided the space into a nave and 2 side aisles. So you can see what it looked like, kind of just a simple structure. You had an altar here, and these are the stones. And one of these was the witness stone of Joshua, which they adapted for these pagan practices. In the front of the temple was a courtyard with a large earthen and stone altar. Tells you the dimensions. An enormous limestone stela, or masaba, stood 6.6 feet further to the southeast. It is 4.8 feet wide, 1.4 feet thick, and, although broken, 4.8 feet high. Huge thing. Since the temple existed in Joshua's day, it is possible this was the large stone which was set up under the oak near the holy place of Yahweh at Shechem, where Abimelech was coronated as king after killing people by these, at this pagan place where it's appropriated now as a pagan place. So again, you have Judges. Judges is a very depressing book because it shows you the effect of paganism and people just losing their way. So there was a lot of crossover happening. The stela is undoubtedly the pillar where Abimelech was made king, and there's many references for that. Here's what it looks like. You can see a video of this on Expedition Bible's website or YouTube channel. This is the standing stone in front of the fortress temple at Shechem. This may be the stone that Joshua erected at Shechem, the pillar. So this is what it looks like. So what's happening here? Well, what's happening is that the worship of Yahweh is being conflated with paganism and pagan ideas. This is the golden calf, Wikipedia. According to the Torah and the Quran, the golden calf was a cult image made by the Israelites when Moses went up Mount Sinai. In Hebrew, the incident is known as the sin of the calf. It is first mentioned in the book of Exodus. Here they are. Bull worship was common in many cultures. In Egypt, whence, according to the Exodus narrative, the Israelites had recently come, the apis was a comparable object of worship. This is what the apis looks like. It's, they had cow gods and bull gods and so on, the sacred bull, which some believe the Hebrews were reviving in the wilderness. Very likely, probably because they grew up in Egypt. And so they say, oh, well, maybe this is our God. Alternatively, some believe Yahweh, the national God of the Israelites, was associated with or pictured as a sacred bull through the process of religious assimilation and syncretism. Again, this is misinformation. The pagans did this, but the people like Moses and David and Abraham never associated an image or an animal to Yahweh. The pagans did because they were confused. This is what I'm trying to get across. And if you realize this, then you can debunk this Yahweh as a pagan god thing very easily. Among the Canaanites, some of whom would become Israelites, the bull was widely worshipped as the sacred bull and the creature of El. I think that's all. There's another article on this somewhere. Yeah, this is from bethelcornerstone.org. The Israelites thought Aaron's cow represented Yahweh, the one true God. This is my point with the poor translation in Exodus. Let's read about it. In Exodus 32, verse 1, we see the word Elohim. This word can either be translated as gods, referring to the gods of the nations, or God, referring to Almighty God, the plural of majesty. That's what I was saying when I said the royal plural, the royal we. When you pluralize something for an individual, it's like the monarchs did it in England. We are not pleased. Well, it's just you. It's not a we, but we say we to magnify the presence. Does Elohim in this verse refer to gods or to God? Were the Israelites asking Aaron to make a false god representing a demon or an image representing the true God? This is an important question. It is, because it reveals to you what's happening in this cross-pollination so that you don't get the wrong idea of, Yahweh's a pagan god. If gods is meant, then this means the Israelites were turning away from God to a false god. However, if God is meant, as in the God, then they were trying to worship the true God using a golden cow. If this is the case, then this is a powerful example of vain worship, an attempt to worship God that is not according to God's word, i.e., from the very beginning with Cain, all the way to modern Catholicism, this has exactly been the problem, and how the devil baits you into false worship. Jesus said those who worship God must worship him in spirit and in truth. This is John 4. True worship must be according to the word of God and authored by the Holy Spirit. If otherwise, it's not worship of the one true God. True. In the Old Testament, the word Elohim is most frequently used to represent true God, the true God, Yahweh. The word is used this way over 2,500 times. In ancient times, many cultures made images of cows for religious purposes. These cows were seen as the thrones of the deity, and spiritual beings were believed to dwell on them, kind of like a counterfeit Ark of the Covenant sort of thing. In Exodus 32, the Israelites probably believed that they were building a throne on which their God Yahweh would dwell. They believed this would help them worship God without waiting for Moses and for God's actual instructions. Do you see the nuance here? They're not saying, okay, let's build a false god. They're just like Saul, who offered improper sacrifices. It's the same impatient situation, is that they're not wanting to worship God on God's terms. So what do? They create a counterfeit. They say, we'll do it. We'll take control over it. This is the problem. Most commentators agree that the word Elohim in Exodus 32 should be translated as God. Commentaries and theologians. Aaron made a golden calf. These are commentaries now. Aaron made a golden calf, that is a bull. It was meant as a visible symbol of Jehovah, the mighty God who had brought Israel out of Egypt. J. Packer. The Cambridge Commentary says the word Elohim is used in this verse for the true God and that the image represents Jehovah. Benson notes that it should be translated, make us a God, as in Elohim is generally ought to be rendered here, as Leclerc observes, and that for two plain reasons. First, Aaron made it but one calf, one idol, not many. And it appears later in Exodus 32:5 that this symbol was consecrated to Jehovah alone. Like when he says, tomorrow we're going to have a feast to Yahweh. Well, yeah, obviously then it's not gods that he made. He made a god, or basically a throne for God. Jameson, Fawcett, and Brown note that the Hebrew word rendered gods is simply the name of God in its plural form. The cow was an image or representation of God, whom after the manner of idolaters they call by God's name. Keel and Delish note that the golden cow was not the image of an Egyptian deity. It was not symbol of the generative or bearing power of nature, but an image of Jehovah. For when it was finished, those who had made the image and handed it over, people said, "This is thy God," plural majesty, as in the majestic plural. Not, "Here's your gods, O Israel." Here's your God that brought you out of Egypt. This is the explanation adopted in Psalm 106, 19 verse 20, which says, "They made a calf in Horeb and worshipped the molded image. Thus they changed the glory of God into the image of an ox that eats grass." Romans 1 talks about this too. They exchange the glory of God for, things that are created. According to Psalm 106, the cow was made to represent Yahweh. So do you see how the translation is an error? Where it says gods in English. It's not a Masoretic issue, it's an English issue. The Israelites thereby changed the invisible glory of God into an image like a cow. This cow was not an attempt to worship Baal or another false god. Very important. It was an attempt to worship God according to their own religious ideas. Exodus 32:4 talks about, here's your God that brought you out of Egypt. In verse 4, the same word Elohim is used. Again, God is the correct translation, as most commentators agree. Jameson says they meant the calf to be an image, a visible sign, or a symbol of Jehovah. The Pulpit Commentary says the calf, when made, was not viewed as an image of an Egyptian god, but as a representation of Jehovah. So all the people that say, look, Yahweh is a pagan god, they're worshiping a pagan cow god. No, not at all. They're very misguided. but they're worshiping Yahweh, and they thought, remember, you got to think like somebody 3,000 years ago. We don't think like that anymore. In their mind, if they created something physical that they could see, now that can bring God to them. It's synergism. It's basically Catholicism, if you think about it. The idea that you can beckon God to do something through your own efforts. If we do this image and we make a throne for Yahweh to come, then he'll come, because Moses is gone probably. Now we've lost Yahweh, and if we build an image, then Yahweh can come and sit on this throne and he can lead us. That was the thinking. It's not they're worshiping pagan deities. Of course, it's still misguided. It's wrong, but that was the thinking, and you need to understand that nuance. Elcott states that the word should be translated as God. Certainly the bull form was more distinctive of the Babylonian and Assyrian than that of Egyptian worship, and it may be suspected that the immigrants from Chaldea had clung through all their wanderings to the mystic symbolism which had been elaborated in that primeval land, and which they would contrast favorably with the coarse animal worship of Egypt. In Chaldea, the bull, generally winged and human-headed, represented the combination of wisdom, strength, and omnipresence, which characterizes divinity, and this combination might well have seemed to carnal minds no unapt symbol of Jehovah. So what's the point? The point is, the Israelites at that time were baby Fennec foxes. They were going for low-hanging fruit. They didn't know how to eat the meat, spit out the bones. They were just babies. And what do they have? Well, they had the traditions of the pagans that they came from. And so they thought, well, we don't want to be left out here in the desert. We need to bring God back to us because Moses is gone and who knows what's happened. We're going to die here. So let's build this throne. Well, what should we make the throne as? Well, we should make it maybe as a cow because that seems to be what all these other people were worshiping. So that makes sense. Maybe Yahweh will come back on this throne and lead us. This is the thinking that these people were thinking. Of course, to us, it seems so ridiculous, but you have to put yourself in their shoes. 3,000 plus years ago. Benson says, this is the image or symbol of thy God who brought thee out of Egypt, for they intended to worship the true God by this image, as afterward Jeroboam did by the same image. It being incredible that the generality of the Israelites should be so void of all sense and reason, as to think that this new man-made calf brought them out of Egypt. Obviously, they didn't think that the new man-made calf brought them out of Egypt. It was a symbol or a throne that Yahweh could come and sit on. Even before its own creation, that this was the same Jehovah that had so lately spoken to them from heaven, with an audible voice saying, I am the Lord thy God who brought you out of the land of Egypt. Barnes says in the next verse, Aaron appears to speak of the calf as if it was a representative of Yahweh. Tomorrow is a feast to Yahweh, the Lord. The Israelites did not, it should be noted, worship a living Menevis or Apis, i.e. the cow god of the Egyptians, having a proper name, but only the golden type of the animal. The mystical notions connected with the ox by the Egyptian priests may have possessed their minds, i.e. the traditions that they grew up with, and when expressed in this modified and less gross manner, may have been applied to the Lord, who had really delivered them out of the hand of the Egyptians. Their sin then lay not in their adopting another god, but in their pretending to worship a visible symbol of him who no symbol could represent. Very important, and this is still valid today. The close connection between the calves of Jeroboam and this calf is shown by the repetition of the formula, quote, which brought thee up out of the land of Egypt. And this is in 1 Kings 12, verse 28. So this is not an isolated incident. The point is, this is when it happened first, once the Exodus was completing. And then you had it with Jeroboam, you had it with other places. Another example, we can look back in the scriptures, is Ezekiel 8, verses 15 through 16. This is the vision that Ezekiel gets. Then he said to me, have you seen this, O son of man? You will see still greater abominations than these. And he brought me into the inner court of the house of Yahweh. And behold, at the entrance of the temple of Yahweh, between the porch and the altar, were about 25 men with their backs to the temple of the Lord, and their faces toward the east, worshiping the sun toward the east. So the priests and the inner people, who was supposed to be the spiritual guidance of the people, were doing pagan worship and sun worship in the temple. Does that sound like something today? Of course it should. We talked about Romans 1 verse 20 through 25. For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived as in you understand the meaning of his invisible attributes. God is not to be made an image of. Ever since the creation of the world in the things that have been made, so they are out without excuse. Everybody knew that there's a creator, but they lost the knowledge of God over time. For although they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him, but they became futile in their thinking and their foolish hearts were darkened. This is the story of the pagans. They knew God. Everybody originated from Adam and Eve, folks. The knowledge of God spread throughout the world, but a lot of people apostatized and went the way of the wind and were deceived by Satan. So God was there in the back of their minds. Yahweh, oh, he's kind of a minor God maybe, or this God. And of course, God allowed that. He allowed people to forget because he always intended on demonstrating his plan of salvation through a tiny little people and all the things that happened that had to happen. But this is describing to you what's happened. Although they knew God, they did not honor him as God, i.e. the Most High, or give thanks to him. They created all kinds of other gods, and they relegated God to just a minor God, or maybe he's in charge of this or in charge of that. Verse 22, claiming to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling mortal man or birds or animals and creeping things. Therefore God gave them up in the lust of their hearts to impurity, to the dishonoring of their bodies among themselves, because they exchanged the truth about God for a lie and worshipped and served the creature rather than the Creator who is blessed forever. Amen. So these sexual acts, especially homosexuality, and lewd acts that these people are doing, is in a way, what Paul is telling you, judgment from God for being idolaters, which is an interesting study in and of its own. But Hosea also, that's another interesting thing in Hosea, chapter 2, verse 16. It says, in that day declares Yahweh, you will call me my husband, and no longer you will call me my Baal. For I will remove the names of the Baals from her mouth, and they shall be remembered by name no more. This is a fascinating, again, another picture into this situation. So in the English, it's kind of hard to pick up what's going on. But in the Hebrew, it's, you will call me Ishi, my Ishi, and no longer my Baal. So what's going on here? What's being contrasted? Because the next verse talks about removing the Baals from her mouth. But if people are calling Yahweh Baal, what is happening here? Well, there's two dynamics that are very interesting. But first you have to understand some language. Baal is owner, possessor, master, lord. It has a very authoritative, rougher connotation. Ishi, which is husband, is the masculine of Isha, is the counterpart of woman. So man, it's used in an intimate way, like this is a relationship, man. So you're going to call me my husband, my man, but in a warm, endearing way, versus my, high and mighty master that I'm very disconnected from. Very important announcement. God is announcing there's a day when there's going to be an intimate relationship. You're no longer going to just call me some distant God off in the sky, but there's an intimate relationship. And there's an article I want to read to you on it. Ishi, not Baal. This is from bltnotjustsandwich.com. It's a good article, though. Don't judge by the URL. Susan McCarthy, 2014. Let's see. So this is a commentary by a rabbi. And again, eat the meat, spit out the bones. It's actually it's a very interesting thing because it's really talking about the original language. What's the Hebrew word for husband? Actually, you have two choices. Both are in use in Hebrew today, and both were used in the time of the Bible. The first word is Baal. If a woman in Israel today wants to refer to her husband, she might refer to him as Baali, my husband. If you know Hebrew, you know that the same word Baal can mean owner. For example, Baal Hai Bait means homeowner or master of the house. And more insidiously, the owner of a slave is also referred to in the Bible as Baal. So you can see this term's etymological origin. It is a relic of a time when a woman's relationship with her husband wasn't that different from the relationship between a servant and a master. There are some people who won't use the word Baal on principle for this reason. So what word would they use instead? The word Ish, most literally, Ish means man, but there are some points in the Bible where the word Ish also means husband. Someone who wanted to say the words my husband in Hebrew could also say Ishi, which is very similar to the Hebrew word for my wife, which means Ishti, which is Ishti. The words Ish and Isha mean man and woman, are etymologically egalitarian words. Unlike the Hebrew word Baal, which establishes a hierarchical relationship between husband and wife. Very interesting. So Baal is more authoritative. There's a hierarchy, whereas Ishi and Isha are egalitarian. There's a dance, the dance of life. There's a relationship. Very interesting. Different connotations. When we think of the history of marriage in the Jewish tradition, actually when we think of the history of gender relations in Jewish tradition, there have been many times when the predominant paradigm was the hierarchical relationship of Baal and Isha, and other times when the predominant paradigm was the egalitarian relationship, Ish and Isha. Normally, I love to talk about how enlightened Jewish tradition has always been about gender relations and has been far ahead of its time in treating women with respect and honor. But whereas it's true that the Jewish tradition was rather enlightened relative to many of its neighbors, it's sadly abundantly clear that women have been at a significant power disadvantage throughout much of Jewish history. One of the most uncomfortable demonstrations of this inequality comes in the Haftarah portion from the book of Hosea that Jewish communities around the world read to accompany the Torah portion of the Bamidbar this year, to be read on May 11th. This passage, the prophet Hosea tries to express why God has been so angry at the people of Israel. He uses the image of a husband whose wife has been unfaithful. He says, "Is this what you would expect when a husband suspects his wife has been unfaithful? Wouldn't you expect him to strip her naked and leave her as on the day she was born, to make her like a wilderness, to render her like a desert land, and let her die of thirst? To hedge up her roads with thorns and raise walls against her?" That's Hosea 2, verse 5. Hosea continues, "Now we know why God is taking such violent anger towards us. It is because we have been unfaithful, worshiping other gods. And God has responded exactly as we would expect any reasonable husband to respond to such infidelity." This marriage metaphor is the central idea in the book of Hosea. And we presume that this metaphor resonated with his audience, who found such a violent response against a disobedient wife to be a logical and justified thing. While we have no data on the extent of domestic violence in the earliest years of our people, the existence of this metaphor in the Bible leads many scholars to the upsetting assumption that it was a phenomenon that was at least widely known and probably widespread. However, a few verses later, the book of Hosea includes a line that can only be understood by those who understand the contrast between Hebrew words Ish and Baal. After God and Israel are reconciled again, God says, "It will happen soon that you will call me Ishi, my husband, and you will no longer call me Baali, my master." Most biblical commentators, traditional and modern, understand Hosea's wordplay to be a reference to the fact that many Israelites were worshiping one of the Canaanite gods, whose name was Baal. But I cannot help but read this line in the light of these two paradigms for a marital relationship: the hierarchical paradigm of Baal and the egalitarian paradigm of Ish. God indicates that someday soon, the relationship between God and Israel will operate on the Ish paradigm, the paradigm of mutual respect rather than the paradigm of domination and hierarchy, which really is the paradigm of the gospel, folks. This is another announcement, a shadow of the things to come, of the new covenant, where you have a relationship with God. Not this thing where you have to try to work your way. And of course, the Old Testament's not about legalism, but that's what the Jews made it to be, and basically God is this, invisible being that you need to be afraid of all the time and walk on eggshells and try to please with your works. That's the Baal paradigm. So this is a very fascinating rabbinic commentary, and I thought it was interesting because it reveals to you a lot of things about this original language. There's just so much going on in this statement. And if you can see it, again, it gives you such nuance in this whole thing with Yahweh and paganism and so on. God is announcing the new covenant, an intimate relationship of trust where there's a dance between two partners. Of course, God is the leader, but you're in a relationship with God. That's the point. Also, it is a polemic, meaning a statement against the idolatrous relationship of Israel, both in worshiping false gods and in worshiping God in the wrong way through the things we described previously. Yes, God wants the heart, not just acknowledging God, obviously. Even the demons believe. James 2 verse 19 says that. But in context, God is basically saying, I will purge the idolatry from your heart and give you pure worship. I'm going to give you the ability to follow my statutes and commands and have discernment so that you are not worshiping me as Baal, but rather as your husband who died for you. That's really the point. So there's two things going on. There's the marriage thing going on, where it's announcing the new covenant, and also there's the polemic against this false counterfeit worship that we consistently see. So I'm just adding these points to all the things we talked about, Romans 1, verse 25, Ezekiel 8, Joshua and the stone of witness that was in Judges 9, Exodus 32 with the golden calf. You see a consistent thread all the way really back to Cain, people trying to worship God and access God's favor, doing it their own way. This has been the mystery religion, folks. There's different flavors, but it's really just all the same thing. Counterfeit worship, because of pagan infiltration, happened throughout the Old Testament and will happen and continue to happen until Jesus returns. Because the book of Revelation tells you that the mystery religion is going to come to the forefront through the Catholic system. And of course, the Catholic system is worshiping God through, your own efforts and trying to be saved and take advantage of God's blessings through your own efforts and your own control of salvation and counterfeit pagan practices and so on and so forth. So it's nothing new under the sun. It's a non sequitur, meaning it doesn't follow that Yahweh is a pagan god because apostate Israelites appropriated God's name to pagan worship. I'm going to repeat that again. It doesn't follow that apostate Israelites appropriating God, like Aaron building a calf for Yahweh to come and lead them, continue to lead them, does not mean that Yahweh is a pagan god. Do you understand? That doesn't follow. What follows is Aaron and all the people there were very deceived at the time of doing that. They didn't understand who God was. They were trying to fit God, who is completely different than all of these pagan religions, into one of those boxes, because that was their framework. It's like trying to talk to a Catholic or Orthodox and trying to explain them, listen, the sacramental system is not true. It's contrary to the gospel. Just like you're trying to talk to the rabbinic Jews and try to tell them that, look, the Torah and your rabbinic writings are contrary to each other. It's two different things. So this is the problem that's always been the case. It's the same argument people have today against the Catholic Church. This is the way the devil gets you, with going from one extreme to another. People know the Roman Catholic Church is basically paganism reborn and repackaged. And as a result, instead of walking the narrow road and saying, okay, well, what's really happened here with history? What's going on? Is there a truth behind this? And of course there is. Jesus is the truth, but they're trying to worship Jesus through a counterfeit pagan way. That's the problem. It's not a counterfeit God. They're worshiping Jesus in a counterfeit way. It's the practice of worship that is false and evil, and trying to save yourself through the sacramental system. But people see all these evils, the papacy and so on, and they say, well, Christianity must be a hoax, must not be true. Do you see the devil gets you either with legalism, i.e., go into the Catholic Church, or you reject the Catholic Church, and as a result, you reject the gospel. So either right or left, doesn't matter. Doesn't matter if you're upset about the Catholic Church, great. If you want to join the Catholic Church, great. Come on in. Doesn't matter. Just don't go on the narrow road. So the devil always gets you left or right. You have to be very careful. God did not reveal himself and do great signs and wonders to all of these tribes. He revealed himself. He did do great signs and wonders, but he did them through the Israelites. Amos 3 verses 1 through 2 says, "Hear this word that Yahweh has spoken against you, O people of Israel, against the whole family that I brought up out of the land of Egypt. You only have I known of all the families of the earth, and therefore I will punish you for all your iniquities." Meaning God did not reveal himself to anybody else. He chose a people to display his power and his plan of salvation and his relationship and his nature, his character, and nobody else. So God hid himself from mankind after the fall. Of course, there was always elect, like Noah had a relationship with God, and then Abraham and Job and so on. There were elect people, but nevertheless, the plan of salvation, for the most part, God was hidden from the majority of human beings after the fall. So people forgot very quickly, especially after the flood, who God was, and they got deceived very quickly. Of course, there was angelic influence. We talk about the Nephilim episode. There was Satan doing all his counterfeits with Nimrod and Tammuz and all that stuff. And God allowed it. God allowed these nations to worship false gods. God allowed the principalities to rebel so that he could show his power and show that he is the ultimate Elohim. He's the Most High. How do you know that he's the Most High? Unless you have other rebellious Elohim that are conquered brutally, and you realize, oh wow, God, Yahweh is the Most High. You wouldn't have any context for that unless the rebellions were allowed. Still, very important point, very, very important point to understand. Despite this forgetting of humankind, we still see fascinating evidence that Yahweh was known to some degree, even though they maybe didn't know him fully, in so many different cultures around the world. For example, Shangdi in China. Shangdi, also called simply Di, is the name of the Chinese highest deity or Lord above, or Most High, especially deriving from the Shang theology and finding an equivalent in the later Tian or Zhu theology. Although the use of Tian to refer to the absolute God of the universe is predominant in Chinese religion today, Shangdi continues to be used in a variety of traditions, including certain philosophical schools, certain strains of Buddhism, Taoism, Confucianism, and Chinese salvationist religions, and Chinese Protestant Christianity. In addition, it is commonly used by contemporary Chinese, both mainland and overseas, and by the religious and secular groups in the East Asia as a name of a singular universal deity and as a non-religious translation for the God of Abrahamic religions. Etymology. Shangdi is the pinyin romanization of two Chinese characters. The first is Shang, meaning high, or highest, or first, primordial, and Di is typically considered as shorthand for Wangdi, which is the modern Chinese, the title of the emperors of China, first employed in the Qin Huang, roughly some 2,200 years ago, so around the time of Abraham, and is usually translated as emperor. The word itself is derived from 3 Huang and 5 Di, including yellow emperor, Chinese pinyin Huangdi, the mythological originator of the Chinese civilization and the ancestor of the Chinese race. However, Shangdi refers to the high god of Shang, thus meaning deity, manifested God. Thus, the name Shangdi should be translated as highest deity, but also has the implied meaning of primordial deity or first deity in classical Chinese. The deity preceded the title and the emperors of China and were named after him in their role as Tianzi, the sons of heaven. Sound familiar? In the classical text, the highest conception of the heavens is frequently identified with Shangdi, who is described somewhat anthropomorphically. He's also associated with the pole star, the conception of the supreme ruler, and the sublime heavens afterward coalesce or absorb each other. So Shangdi, very interesting. Why I bring this up to you, there's a presentation on YouTube and probably other places on the internet called God in Ancient China. Fascinating, fascinating stuff. Before Confucianism, before Buddha, ancient China was monotheistic. And the original ancient Chinese alphabet were pictograms that portray the story of the Bible with the fall, with the flood, with all these different things, and it's just fascinating. It's a fascinating presentation. But Shangdi they were monotheistic and they worshipped the Most High, which is very interesting. This is the Great Spirit on Wikipedia. The Great Spirit is an omnipresent supreme life force, generally conceptualized as a supreme being or God. The Great Spirit is a central component in many, but not all, indigenous cultures in Canada and the United States, and interpretations of it vary between cultures. Conceptualization. The Great Spirit has at times been conceptualized as an anthropomorphic celestial deity, a god of creation, history, and eternity who also takes personal interest in the world affairs and might regularly intervene in the lives of human beings. Numerous individuals are held to have been speakers for the Great Spirit. Persons believed to serve as an earthly mediator responsible for facilitating communication between humans and the supernatural more generally. Such a speaker is generally considered to have an obligation to preserve the spiritual traditions of their respective lineage. The Great Spirit is looked to by spiritual leaders for guidance, by individuals as well as communities at large. While belief in an entity or entities known as the Great Spirit exists across numerous indigenous American peoples, individual tribes often demonstrate varying degrees of cultural divergence. This part is important. As such, a variety of stories, parables, fables, and messages exhibiting different, sometimes contradictory themes and plot elements have been attributed to the same figure by otherwise disparate cultures. So we're going to read a little bit about the Cherokees. I believe, is it Cherokees? Yeah, Cherokees. Oh, you're so annoying with your powered by Weebly stupid thing. Okay, let's see how we can make this a little more zoomed out. There we go. Teeny tiny. I'm going to have to squint like crazy to read this to you. It's so much easier when you're reading it in, full view. But anyway, oh gosh, this is going to be silly. The Cherokee revered the Great Spirit, said by some sources to be called YHWH. The Cherokees revered the Great Spirit and called the Great Spirit YHWH. Isn't that interesting? A name so sacred that only a priest could say it. But in the ancient legends, this is going to take a little bit of effort to read, sorry. The ancient legends simply referred to as the apportioner or that presided over all things and created the earth. The theology of YHWH was slightly panentheistic in nature. The Cherokee belief, the physical universe was an expression of the spiritual, and life was the connection between the physical and the spiritual universes. Thus, life was sacred, especially human life, and the spirits had to be asked for an animal that was about to be killed in a hunt before it could be killed. It was believed that when a certain plant or animal would be extinct or died out, it was because the power from YHWH had given its substance and his life had been taken back for a time. Isn't that what the Bible says? The spirit goes back to God? Fascinating. The Cherokees believed that all spirits and the forces of nature come out of YHWH and were subjected to him. And the people were the center of YHWH's creation. Unlike several tribes, the Cherokee didn't consider there to be a sky father and earth mother, but rather considered YHWH, the Great Spirit, to be the single supreme being, and the earth to be the place that he had created for them. YHWH was omnipresent, omnipotent, and omniscient. Crazy. Some scholars have considered the Cherokee beliefs about YHWH and the resulting spirituality to be the major reason why they so easily accepted Christianity upon the advent of the white settlers. The Christians' parallels are obvious. Both Christianity and Cherokee theology include one spirit God that created the physical universe, an existing spiritual universe, and an order and structure to nature and the existence of other spirits, good and bad, where YHWH, Yahweh, is supreme over them. He's the source of life. There's no feminine component. He's singularly sovereign. So the Cherokees, the ancient Chinese, were monotheistic. And you can see these shades of the truth. Again, God did not pick these people to reveal his plan of salvation, but we see in them that there are memories, echoes of the truth that got lost over time. Some of them preserved a little more knowledge, like the Cherokees, but some of them lost knowledge. Of course, you see, they weren't consistent. Like other Indian tribes believed all kinds of things. So people went the way of the wind left and right, and eventually, of course, Satan got the best of them. But the point is that all of these things remember an old truth. Fascinating that the Cherokees refer to their single spirit God who is sovereign and over all things and the source of life as YHWH. What are the odds of that? I mean, it's just so profound. I'd be curious to see how Cherokee translates. What are the vowels and the consonants of Cherokee? What are the rules of the Cherokee language? And if you could transliterate that, would it result in Yahweh? So it's so fascinating. I think this stuff is just absolutely fascinating. But the conclusion is what? The conclusion is that mankind began with one family, Adam and Eve, and Adam and Eve knew God. Adam and Eve knew God, but of course they fell and they went out of connection with God. There was always a link to God through the elect, through Enoch, Noah, Job, Abraham, and so on, and Moses, and so on. But nevertheless, God, the memory of God had faded out for most of humanity. Because God had chosen only one people to demonstrate his plan, the rest of humanity was left to the pagan forces, Satan and the fallen angels. Many myths, counterfeit stories, various beliefs got intermixed with the truth, and you had, various shades of gray. Still, we can see the shadows from these previous cultures, the ancient cultures, that had shades of the truth with monotheism, which is just fascinating. But who knows? Maybe I'm inclined to believe that maybe God intervened in these cultures in some degree. Maybe he sent people to warn these cultures to repent and come back to the truth. Maybe these people, by their worship of Yoah, had their, it's again justified by faith. We don't know. Again, this is something where people ask, well, how do you explain, how are people saved before the cross that never knew about God? Well, you don't know that they never knew. Obviously, monotheism and the knowledge of God was somewhat there. They were more monotheistic cultures than just the Hebrews in the Middle East. So this to me indicates that God was involved in the world, obviously intervening. Maybe he sent people to warn these cultures and repent, and there's a relationship there somehow. But obviously there was one group of people that was chosen to demonstrate his plan of salvation. So that's an important thing. We don't know. Those things are fun to speculate. But either way, in Joshua 9, verses 9 through 10, it says, "They said to him, 'From a very distant country our servants have come because of the name of Yahweh your God. For we have heard a report of him and all that he did in Egypt.'" These are the, I think it's Gibeonites or some pagans that came, and basically they're trying to get favor from Joshua. So they heard a report of Yahweh's great deeds in Egypt. And verse 10, "And all that he did to the two kings of the Amorites who were beyond the Jordan, to Sihon the king of Heshbon and the Og king of Bashan who lived in Ashtaroth," which, by the way, Og was a Nephilim. So even before the internet, word spread pretty fast in those days. In 1 Kings 20, verses 26 through 28, it says this, "In the spring, Ben-Hadad mustered the Syrians and went up to Aphek to fight against Israel. And the people of Israel were mustered and were provisioned and went against them. The people of Israel encamped before them like two little flocks of goats, but the Syrians filled the country. And a man of God came near and said to the king of Israel, 'Thus says Yahweh, because the Syrians have said that Yahweh is God of the hills, but he is not a God of the valleys. Therefore I will give all of this great multitude into your hand, and you shall know that I am Yahweh.' And then they encamped opposite one another 7 days. Then on the seventh day the battle was joined, and the people of Israel struck down 100,000 on foot in one day. And the rest fled into the city. 27,000 men were left. Ben-Hadad also fled and entered an inner chamber in the city, and so on." So what happened here? Well, the Syrians had heard report about God, and they'd heard God's reputation, Yahweh's reputation throughout the pagan world has started to spread. But they didn't know who God actually was. Do you understand? So they're trying to fit him into this pantheon of theirs. Well, he must be God of the hills, but he's not God of the valleys. And God said, okay, if you think I'm just God of the hills, then all of this multitude is going to be delivered into this tiny little group of Israelites that I have, and you're all going to be slaughtered through my supernatural power. This is what's being demonstrated. And you will know that I am Yahweh, i.e. you will know that I am God of all things, not just the hills. But this interchange describes to you the pagan perception of Yahweh as there's a God. He has to be a God somehow, but how does he belong in the greater scheme of things? I don't know. Maybe he's just God of the hills. Maybe he's God of the valleys. Maybe he's God of the storms. And so they all had their various stories of them. And of course, as the conquerings and the battles went forward and God demonstrated his power, then his reputation grew. But of course, also what happened as the Canaanites and the various pagans were destroyed, their pantheons, the way that they worshipped God and other gods, was applied to God as a way to basically boast in the Lord. The Israelites borrowed language like El, like Israel, and El Shaddai, and so on, to appropriate to God as saying, look, this is the God. This is the God of the universe, El Shaddai. He's our true God. Yahweh is El Shaddai. There is no other El besides Yahweh. That's the point. And so they appropriated these things through their military conquests so that not only they had language to describe these things and give titles and glory to God, but also as a polemic to the other surrounding cultures that were still worshiping Dagon and El and all these things. Say, look, no, Yahweh, our God, is actually El Shaddai. Your El is a nothing. You're not worshiping the right God. This is El in that sense. So these are the interactions that are happening. Hopefully you're realizing these things, because even in English, we have words that we borrow from English, from German, or from German and French, where we didn't have words to describe certain things. Well, the Israelites didn't have words like El that referred to God, or El Shaddai, or all these various titles that I read to you at the very beginning. They didn't have the vocabulary for that, so they borrowed it from the Canaanites and appropriated it to God. Not because it doesn't follow, because they did that God is that Yahweh is a pagan deity. Do you understand? No, Yahweh existed before time, but as they conquered these pagan cultures, the words, the vocabulary to refer to their God was appropriated to God, and saying, no, God is Adonai, God is Lord Almighty, God is El Shaddai, God is El, so on and so forth. This is what's happening. It doesn't mean that Yahweh is made up. It doesn't mean that Yahweh was taken from the Canaanites or any other pagans. It does not mean that Yahweh is a pagan name, or that it's anything pagan in nature at all. These articles and the people who argue this aren't using the Bible as primary evidence. This is the problem. And of course, as a result, all you have is pagan evidence, and pagans we know are not to be trusted. Of course, there's historical value in these things, but they're not the primary evidence, because pagans were consigned to the rebellious Elohim. They basically were deceived to some degree. Paganism is an inversion, it's a counterfeit. And as a result, by accepting it as the primary source of evidence, you're going to believe an inversion, a counterfeit, which is that, Yahweh is a pagan God. No, Yahweh is not a pagan God. So many counterfeits have happened since the beginning of time, even after the flood. You have, for example, early Babylonian Nimrod, Tammuz, and Semiramis, counterfeiting the Trinity. Of course, the Trinity is not three gods, but these are counterfeit religious practices that people worshipped. And of course, there's a lot of worship of Tammuz in the Bible documented. Sumerian, Enki, Anu, Enlil, Egyptian, Osiris, Isis, and Horus. Satan has tried to counterfeit the truth countless times, folks. The mystery religion is nothing new. It's just countless versions of counterfeits. These articles, unfortunately, take Satan's testimony over the Bible's, and what do you get as a result? Well, you get nonsense. That's what you get. It's no different with anyone that you argue. They're always rejecting God's word. Absolutely. This is the thing you have to realize, that anybody who believes these things does not believe that God's word is ineffable or inerrant and infallible. That's the word I was looking for, not ineffable. Remember also, again, that the Bible says, Isaiah 44:6, Yahweh says, I'm the first and the last. Revelation 1, verse 17 through 18, Jesus says, I'm the first and the last, the living one. So what does that mean? Well, Jesus is claiming to be Yahweh. Therefore, there is a consistent God throughout history that the Bible presents. There is no adoption from paganism, which is, of course, is nonsense. But I want you to notice that all of the components of the forbidden fruit are wrapped into this particular argument. You can't trust God's word, so they use pagan evidence over the testimony of the Holy Spirit. You can't trust God's character. Yahweh is an evil pagan God, and he's different from Jesus in some way. You can't trust God's sovereignty. Oh, Yahweh is just a lesser God. He was, just adopted by the Israelites. All three of the forbidden fruit threads are wrapped up in this particular deception, an argument. But the pagans were worshiping demons and Satan, and we know that from 1 Corinthians 10, verse 20 through 21. No, I imply that pagans sacrifice they offer to demons and not to God. I do not want you to be participants with demons. They're worshiping demons, fallen principalities and spiritual powers that are masquerading as gods and goddesses and so on and so forth. I talked about this. I'm not going to read this, but I talk about this in my Nephilim episode. This is the stele they found on Mount Hermon. The documents the fallen angels landing and basically committing an oath to serve Satan, basically. They can be their own gods. And they worshipped Satan as God. And there's a lot of interesting things to be discussed here. Also, the Feast of Sukkot, which is basically Yahweh using that feast right after the pagan feasts were done to show that the future destiny or destination of the 70 sons that he had apportioned territory to, and of course they apostatized and leading all these pagan nations astray. So he's going to show, okay, you see like these bulls, they're getting sacrificed and they're going to get killed. Well, that's your fate. And little by little, conquering territory and taking it back. This has been the plan of history to reveal God's sovereignty. Now, the conclusion on this is that God was sending these rebellious principalities a message in the Old Testament and revealing his plan of salvation one victory at a time. Pagans worshiped the devil and demons and made basically the devil the god of gods, Dagon or El, whatever. Even compare Allah with the Muslims. Al-Ilah is where it comes from, which is the God, which is, of course, the God of many names, the God of this world. Satan has always tried to be worshipped as God, always. That's been his goal. And of course, at the end of time, the Bible tells you that he's been going to be successful. God revealed his plan one victory at a time through the Israelites, took turf away from these principalities to give context for who he is. We talked about the Feast of Sukkot, and of course the many Psalms that are appropriations of, faithful Israelites where, like David, he's appropriating certain things like Rahab. We'll read about it. Do I have it in here somewhere? I think I have it in here somewhere. Yeah, I do have it. We're going to read it in just a little bit. But where David appropriates something like Rahab, the sea monster, which is a pagan mythology, to God as a way to praise God as the one who's actually sovereign, and also as a polemic against these pagan cultures to say, look, our God is the one who's doing this stuff, man, not yours. This is the point. But if you don't have that piece of context, you read a psalm where David is mentioning Rahab, the sea monster, and you're saying, oh, you see, the Israelites just got it from their pagan neighbors. No, that's not what's going on. That's not what's going on at all, folks. It's really not. Now, let's review this challenge in Deuteronomy 30 with all that out of the way. Deuteronomy 32, 8 through 9. This is the verse, the beloved verse that people love to go to and twist the heck out of. When the Most High gave to the nations their inheritance, when he divided mankind, he fixed the borders of the peoples according to the number of the sons of God. Verse 9. But Yahweh's portion is his people, Jacob his allotted heritage. So there you go. Yahweh is the son of the Most High, and he's one of the lesser gods. The Most High is actually this invisible Father God that you don't even know, but Yahweh was just one of the lesser pagan gods that the Most High assigned a portion to. Is this how we read it? Of course not. This is a perfect example of how to take something brutally out of context and go with the low-hanging fruit and your flesh as an interpreting guide. The argument that these two are two different gods, the Most High and Yahweh, is absolutely nonsense. And if you read it in context, which we will, let's read it from verse 1 to 12. Let's see who it's really by. Give ear, O heavens, and I will speak, and let the earth hear the words of my mouth. May my teaching drop as rain, my speech distill as the dew, like gentle rain upon the tender grass, and like showers upon the herb. For I will proclaim the name of Yahweh, ascribe greatness to our God. The rock, his work is perfect, for all his ways are justice. A God of faithfulness and without iniquity, just and upright is he. They have dealt corruptly with him, they are no longer his children because they are blemished. They are a crooked and twisted generation. Do you thus repay Yahweh, you foolish and senseless people? Is not he your father who created you, who made you and established you? Remember the days of old, consider the years of many generations. Ask your father and he will show you, your elders, and they will tell you. Now we get to the verse. When the Most High gave to the nations their inheritance, when he divided mankind, he fixed the borders of the peoples according to the number of sons of God. But Yahweh's portion is his people, Jacob his allotted heritage. What is the meaning of this? A couple more verses will break it down in context. He found him in a desert land, and in the howling waste in the wilderness, he encircled him and he cared for him. He kept him as the apple of his eye. Like an eagle that stirs up its nest, that flutters over its young, spreading out its wings, catching them, burying them on his pinions. Yahweh alone guided him. No foreign god was with him. Of course, people say, see, proof that Yahweh is one of the lesser gods. No, it's telling you the same thing I've been telling you throughout this whole presentation, is that there's been a consistent relationship with God's people. The people who are gods, Abraham, Noah, the elect, and so on and so forth, they did not worship multiple gods. They had a one-on-one intimate relationship with God. That's the point. And this is what this is saying. And of course, the context here is the Most High is Yahweh. When the Most High gave to their nations their inheritance, he divided the nations of mankind. He fixed the borders of the peoples according to the numbers of the sons of God. Yeah. Out of that, Yahweh's portion is his people, Jacob, his allotted heritage. It's not comparing Most High and Yahweh. It's comparing Most High / Yahweh and the sons of God. Do you see the category error that's happening? It's a false equivalency, equating two things that you're not supposed to be equating. The comparison here is between Yahweh and the sons of God, who were given territories and they rebelled. And of course, that was all by design. It's not between the Most High and Yahweh. That is absolutely taking it out of context, which is totally nonsense. But why? Why? Well, the reason is because Yahweh claims there's no other God besides him in Isaiah. So people who love to use this verse, Deuteronomy, and say, you see, this is two different gods. Yahweh is actually the son of the Most High, and he's a lesser God. Well, Yahweh also claims to be the only God, and he's the first and the last, the self-existent one. Yahweh is listed as by Moses in the Pentateuch, who wrote Deuteronomy, by the way, in Genesis 2, as the creator. So the person who wrote Deuteronomy, part of the Pentateuch, and also Genesis, i.e. Moses, who had first eyewitness with Yahweh, also says in another place that Yahweh is the creator. Well, there's no other creator besides the Most High. There's only one God. Jesus claims to be Yahweh, evidence point number 3. And of course, this is attributing positive things to Yahweh, praise and glory. It's not saying that Yahweh is this lesser tribal deity that's violent and evil. No, Yahweh is good. That's the whole point of this section here. Yahweh is the source of the blessings. And of course, Yahweh is being compared to the sons of God, not the Most High. The comparison is between the people who were given territories and Yahweh kept for himself his own people, not the Most High gave territories to everybody, including Yahweh. That's not how this is read, folks. And of course, if you read it in context, there's no way that you could read it out of context, but people just go here and say, oh, you see, must be two different people, because they have no concept of anything. So this is not even a challenge, but it can be a challenge if you don't have context and if you don't understand these things. With the history of people's integration into a pagan world around them and Yahweh displaying his power, pagan forces coming and surrounding, there's apostasy, there's a dynamic cross-pollination that's happening constantly to reveal God's power as the sovereign, as the one who saves you, as the one who gives you awareness, as the one who determines whether you believe or not. I have reserved for me 7,000 that have not bowed the knee to Baal. Okay, that means that those who did bow the knee, God allowed them to be apostate. The ones who he reserved were elect and were kept for faith, and they were saved. Do you get it? So God is the one who determines salvation. Therefore, the whole point of having these enemies is to prove that without God, you are gone by the way of the wind, folks. There's no chance that you had to believe in God, because these deceptions are just so prevalent. So, conclusion, Yahweh is not a pagan name, but the pagans knew about God. They knew from old stories of God in the common human narrative over centuries, and also from local events that were told, like the Exodus and all these judgments and military victories. As God revealed himself, they added to the mythology of Yahweh and tried to place him in different places in the pantheon and so on. Of course, a common practice in paganism is to exaggerate or to add untrue details and make mythologies and so on. And we know that from many places, like the Egyptian military records, the Assyrian records. Like, for example, there's a stele that Sennacherib that's been found. It's a very old stele, but it omits the defeat at Jerusalem. It says, we claimed victory over this second largest city, but basically Sennacherib actually failed. If you read the Bible, it tells you, yeah, he defeated a lot, but then when he came to Jerusalem, he lost horribly, and he got sent home, and then he got killed. So that's not recorded. So these things are part of pagan practices because paganism is very egocentric. They're not going to record military losses. So you have to understand that even like with Egypt, they hardly recorded military defeats. This is why it's like, there's no evidence for the Exodus. Well, do you think Egyptians would have a very detailed record of Yahweh destroying their empire and humiliating them? No, not at all. We have some evidence that proves that they knew that there was a Yahweh to these nomadic peoples, and that's good enough as far as I'm concerned, because I don't need pagan sources to prove it, but they are nice to have. That proves the Bible. Of course, we know others like Babylon, Persia, Greece, and Rome, full of mythology. So compare that now to Hebrew scribes, who were extremely meticulous because they didn't want to get anything wrong, because you're dealing with God's words, and they didn't want to sin, to Gilgamesh and the Epic of Gilgamesh with exaggeration and mythology. You can't even compare the two. That's why the Bible's different. Pagan tribes always exaggerated because they didn't have God working through them, through his Holy Spirit, and they didn't have the conviction of heart in trying to preserve the information to honor God. It was more about just, whatever sounded nice and whatever, went with the wind. Eventually, Israelites conquered these tribes and adopted some of the language to glorify God as the conqueror and the God of gods. Example being El. El is a Canaanite suffix. It's the Canaanite God, but it's used as a suffix or a prefix. El Shaddai or Israel. Israelites were showing that Yahweh is the true God by using this word that was imported into Hebrew. Of course, the imagery of other pagan gods is used as a comparison to boast in the Lord. We'll look at an example, which basically, what they're saying through these things is, look, God is actually El, you pagans. You need to realize that our God, Yahweh, is the true God. He's El Shaddai. He's God Almighty. He's so on and so forth. An example of this is Psalm 89, verses 5 through 13. We're going to look at this in the viewer. Let's pull it up. Let the heavens praise your wonders, O Yahweh, your faithfulness in the assembly of the holy ones. For who in the skies can be compared to Yahweh? Who among the heavenly beings is like Yahweh? A God created to be feared in the council of the holy ones, and awesome above all who are around him. O Yahweh, God of hosts, who is mighty as you are, O Yahweh, with your faithfulness all around you. You rule the raging of the sea. When its waves arise, you still them. You crushed Rahab like a carcass. Rahab is the giant sea monster. You scattered your enemies with your mighty arm. The heavens are yours, the earth is also yours, the world and all that is in it. You have founded them. The north and the south, you have created them. Tabor and Hermon joyously praise your name. You have a mighty arm, strong as your hand, high as your right hand. So somebody who's uneducated looks at this and says, you see, the Israelites just got their Yahweh mythology from the pagans. No, that's not what's going on here. There's a nice little commentary that we're going to read on it. Where is it at? Let's see. Study guide for Psalm 89, 119. And here it is. I had it out of order for some silly reason. Psalm 89, study guide. And there's a section here. I hope it kept my highlights it better because I used the sneaky highlight. Okay, there we go. You have broken Rahab in pieces as one who has slain Rahab. Rahab is often taken as the personification of proud and strong Egypt. This may be true in this context, yet there is also a fascinating connection to the Canaanite mythology of that time, transforming and using the connection to glorify God as in the incomparable one. The name Rahab means proud one, and in Canaanite mythology, the sea god Yam was subdued and the sea serpent Rahab was killed at creation. Here, as in Job 26, perhaps Ethan had in mind, this Canaanite mythology is transformed and used to teach something. Later, the prophet Isaiah would use the same imagery and tone in speaking of Yahweh's great victory over Rahab. Are you not the arm that cut Rahab apart and wounded the serpent? In the ancient Middle East, there were many legends about the gods who fought other gods in creating the earth. Ethan, Asaph, and Job, and Isaiah may have known these stories and used them to draw attention to the true God, Yahweh. It is Yahweh who rules the raging of the sea, even though the ancient legend said Tiamat, the deep, was the chaotic goddess defeated by the hero god Marduk Bel, or that Yam, the sea, was defeated by Baal. It is Yahweh who cuts Rahab in pieces, not Marduk or Baal. There is the possibility that there is a grain of historical truth communicated in these ancient mythologies and legends. Ancient rabbinic mythology suggests that an evil serpent was in the primeval sea resisting creation, and that God killed the serpent and brought order to the world as described in Genesis 1, verse 2. In these rabbinic traditions, I don't really believe that. I believe the Bible. But either way, you can see what's going on here. Satan is often represented as a dragon or a serpent, and the sea is thought of as a dangerous or threatening place in the Jewish mind. It's possible that Rahab is another serpent-like manifestation of Satan, who was the original proud one. It is also possible that Leviathan refers to the same creature. It is important to note that the Hebrew scriptures do not simply believe or adopt this Canaanite mythology. Very important point. They take it and transform it, using it to exalt Yahweh in a way that Canaanite myths never did. This is what's happening. If you don't understand this literary context, you will be very easily swayed by these arguments that Yahweh is a pagan deity. Elmer Smick notes this in the Expositor's Bible Commentary on Job. Here the sea that God subdues is not the deity Yam. Job depersonalized Yam by using the definite article, the sea, thus expressing his innate monotheistic theology. Furthermore, by his own wisdom, skill, and power, he cut Rahab to pieces and pierced the gliding serpent, unlike Marduk, who depended on the enablement of the father gods. So again, these are polemics against pagans, folks. It's the opposite of what they're telling you. A study of the Old Testament names for the well-known Canaanite mythological sea monsters like Rahab shows how purposely the Old Testament authors used the language to enrich their own poetic conceptions of the supremacy of the one and only true God. This is poetry, it's worship, and it's also polemics against these neighboring cultures that were pagan and that were trying to basically insist on their way of worship. And these are saying, look, God, Yahweh is the one who tore the serpent in two. It's a worship. It's not necessarily stating that this is what happened pre-cosmos. It's a polemic against these pagan cultures, which is very important. So, conclusion, people misinterpreted these verses and say that the Israelites just stole pagan gods and added attributes to Yahweh, which is not true. This is not what's happening at all. When you examine very deeply the historical context and also you treat the Bible as the Word of God. The Israelites were boasting in the Lord, the faithful ones were boasting in the Lord because he was the only one with true power. Shaming idols and false gods of pagan nations by praising God through these polemics was very common practice. And they were showing the true God and claiming all the pagan boasting that these pagans were doing was actually due to God. You get the point? So, no, Yahweh is not a pagan deity, nor was he ever a pagan god. Yahweh is not a name that the Israelites took from the pagans. Yahweh is not a minor god, or by chance he kind of just made it and the Israelites won all these military victories and he became God Almighty as a result. Yahweh is the creator God who was unknown to most of humanity until really Jesus. Now Jesus reigns in heaven and we can spread the good news without having to worry about tribal politics and military conquests, because all authority has been given to Jesus. He rules from heaven, and when he returns, he's going to judge the living and the dead. Now, there's a challenge. We're almost done with this section, but boy, there's just so much to talk about, isn't there? There's a challenge that says, why did Jesus or the apostles or the Christians never pray to Yahweh? Well, actually, Jesus did use the divine name. We looked at that previously in Luke, where is this? Luke 4:16 through 17, where he says, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me. Very likely, this is citing the scriptures where it's Isaiah 61 verse 1, and says, the Spirit of the Lord God is upon me because Yahweh has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. So very likely, in English, this is translated to Lord, and remember the problems with the English and the Greek and the Hebrew. There's many translations that happened where the divine name eventually kind of lost out of style, but very likely Jesus, during his ministry, when he read from these scriptures, probably pronounced the divine name, not just Lord. If the scripture was in Greek, there's a chance that it might have been Kyrios, Lord, or maybe Yahweh. Who knows? But in Jerusalem, likely they were in Hebrew, and especially in the synagogues, they probably had some very authentic scriptures. Remember that the older translations into Greek kept the divine name originally when the Jews translated the Septuagint, and they wrote it in like a square script, Aramaic. Eventually that turned into a transliterated Yahweh, and then eventually it went to Kyrios. So, there's stages to these things. Remember the early article about the Nazarenes who basically kept saying Yahweh. Paul supposedly was maybe persecuted for trying to get people to see like, hey, Jesus is Yahweh. You're saying the divine name. How dare you? And they're trying to persecute him. Jesus' high priestly prayer, Jesus reading from Isaiah. Very likely, Jesus said the divine name, and so did Paul. Very likely. However, there's an asterisk with everything, folks. And that asterisk is that by Jesus' time, the sacred name wasn't really pronounced by most people, except by priests or during special times of the year or special occasions and so on. There was also the superstition and the prohibition against using it for the rabbinic system, and people were afraid of being accused of blasphemy and so on. Of course, obviously, Jesus wasn't afraid, but nevertheless, you had these dynamics that made things very complicated. So the sacred name was not used casually, like on the street, or people were blessing each other in the name of Yahweh, like they did in the First Temple era, because the rabbinic system had come along. Remember also that the pronunciation had become relatively obscured. Hellenization took over. Jesus appeals to this sacred name in John 8, and they wanted to stone him, so obviously that's another instance of him using the sacred name to some degree, whether it's in Hebrew that he was speaking, and this account in the Gospels took that and put it in Greek to get the sense, or this was Greek, and either way, he's appealing to Yahweh in Exodus 3. In Acts 4, verse 12, it says, no other name. Let's see what it says. No other name. How does it actually? There is no salvation in no one else, for there is no other name under heaven given among men by which men must be saved. Which we must be saved. So there's no other name. Well, but does that mean a specific name like the way you pronounce it, or does it mean something else? Well, to the apostles and disciples, Jesus was the incarnate Yahweh. You understand? Paul, Jude, John, Peter, all explicitly call Jesus God. There's no other God. They're all Jews. They know that Yahweh is God. Therefore, for them, Jesus is Yahweh, made flesh, made manifest. God's name slowly revealed over time, from God Almighty to Moses, Yahweh, and of course, the full revelation in Yeshua, Jesus. Jesus is God. All the attributes, all the nature, the full divine power and nature is made manifest in Jesus. Therefore, the Word made flesh, the name, Jesus, is the name that you have a relationship with. So the disciples Jesus probably used the sacred name. The apostles probably used the sacred name when they were talking to Jesus in private. They probably used it amongst themselves, but of course we're very cautious because of tradition. I'm just assuming here. This is an educated guess. This is not with the Bible documents. But I'm guessing, probably, Christians and apostles after Jesus had no reason to use the sacred name because they had Jesus. And a lot of the Christians were also converts from the Greeks, from other places. So they used Jesus. And we have a whole section on Yeshua in the end of this. But nevertheless, they had no reason to speak the sacred name. They just had no reason to. They were pagan converts. They had no history of the sacred name like the Jews did. So why would they say the sacred name? Who's the God? Oh, Jesus is the God. Yeshua, Jesus? Okay, Jesus is my God. Okay, that's the God that I'll worship. The pagans had no reason to say Yahweh. It would be like Moses using a previous name that God had given, like Elohim, instead of the name God gave him to use. So in other words, like God gave him in Exodus 3, here's my name, Yahweh. Okay, then Moses comes down from the mountain and says, okay, Elohim says this. Well, wait, what? That doesn't make any sense. No, he's going to say Yahweh says this. This is God's name. So it's the same type of thing. Like there'd be no reason for him to choose this particular way of referring to God. Later generations did, for the various reasons we've discussed, but it's a non sequitur. In other words, it doesn't follow that just because Jesus and the disciples in the early church didn't use God's divine name or sacred name, that Yahweh is a pagan god, or there's some difference between Jesus and Yahweh, all these fantastical theories. In fact, we have proof from the early church, from Clement of Alexandria and all those things I looked at with you, where the Greek is very clear that was actually preserved. Yahweh. Remember, I-A-U-E-I was in the Greek. But either way, Jesus not explicitly using the sacred name in the New Testament in our English Bibles does not mean that he didn't use it, or that Yahweh is a pagan name, or that Jesus and Yahweh are two different gods, or that Yahweh is made up by the Jews to deceive people. So either way you cut it, the whole Yahweh being pagan is a non sequitur. It doesn't follow, and it falls apart once you actually consider history and the Bible as your primary source of evidence. So, boy, that was quite a mouthful, but there's more to come. Now onwards to part 6, is Yahweh an occult name? Well, just when you thought we were off to the next part, there's more. While I was checking my notes and comparing them to my Google tabs, something was missing. And I realized that I had omitted a very important argument that people like to bring up in this particular topic of Yahweh and paganism. And the reason I didn't cover it is because eSword had deleted, it didn't save the most recent version of my notes, which I backed them up, thankfully. But here we are, back to this topic really quickly. I want to cover an objection that people bring, which is, well, there's this time in the Bible where Yahweh lost to a foreign god and it's not really talked about. Well, not so fast. Of course, we're going to entertain both sides and see what the arguments are. And this first video I want to show you is by a scholar, Daniel McClellan, who we're going to look at in the future as well. He's not a believing Jew. He's not a Christian. I think he's just a secular scholar. But nevertheless, he brings up some things in various topics on the things we're talking about today. So we should consider his perspective and see how we can take what we can from it. And if there are things that we need to refute, we will refute them. So this first video, it's actually just one video, but then there's a commentary that we're going to read. And this is from, you can see it good, from Daniel McClellan. So let's listen and see what's up.
There's a story in the Bible about the God of Israel losing in battle to the God of another nation. Hey everybody, I'm Dan McClellan. I'm a scholar of the Bible and religion. Before we get to that story, I want to talk briefly about another story and ask a question about it. This other story is found in 2 Kings 18 and 19, and it tells the story of the king of Judah, Hezekiah, throwing off vassalage under the Assyrian king Sennacherib. This angers the Assyrian king, who mounts an invasion and comes in from the north, destroys the land in the kingdom of Israel, destroys most of the land of Judah, gets to Jerusalem. Sennacherib's own inscription says, "I trapped him in his capital city like a bird in a cage." Just before he's going to destroy Jerusalem, God intervenes because of a prayer that is offered by Hezekiah and another one that is offered by Isaiah. God kills 185,000 Assyrian troops, which is obviously not historical. But the
Obviously, right.
text states that Sennacherib got up the next day, saw that everybody was dead, and it says he got up and left, obviously retreating. Now the question is, who won this battle? Was this a victory on the part of Sennacherib, or was this a victory on the part of Hezekiah? Very clearly, this is considered a victory on the part of Hezekiah, particularly in light of the way God's intervention is represented. So, take that thought, and now let's go look at a parallel story.
So, just in summary, so you understand the argument that he's trying to put forward. Obviously, he's biased when you say, oh, obviously that's not historical. What do you mean it's not historical? So far yet, there has been no discovery archaeologically that has been disproving the Bible. If anything, all the discoveries that we do find in the Near East, they prove the Bible's story of things. The Exodus, all the various places, like the towns, like Jericho and Sodom and Gomorrah and so on and so forth. All the discoveries they've made, there's been so many that confirm the Bible. So what do you mean? Oh, obviously it's not historical. Meaning, oh, obviously that could not have happened. It's just an exaggeration. No, there was 185,000 troops and the angel of Yahweh came down and killed them all, probably with the snap of his fingers to demonstrate his power. Anyway, that's a tangent. The point that he's trying to make is that based on what the Bible says about Sennacherib and Hezekiah, how Sennacherib was fleeing after this situation happened, that was considered a defeat. Okay, this is his argument. He's going to commit a false equivalency in just a second, i.e. he's going to equate two things that aren't equatable. Because this, therefore this. This is going to be his argument. Even though he's very educated, because of his bias and he's not being guided by the Spirit, you can see that he's committing an error because of his bias. But this is the error that he's about to commit. He's going to say, because this was treated as a defeat, so Sennacherib running away was treated as a defeat, you're going to see that he's going to say, because now in the future, when the Israelites retreat, therefore God must have been defeated. This is the argument, okay? But it's not true.
2 Kings 3, there's a new Moabite king under vassalage to the nation of Israel. That king decides to throw off vassalage to Israel, which angers the Israelite king. And he gets the king of Judah and the king of Edom to form a coalition, and they mount an invasion into Moab, and they destroy most of the land of Moab, and they get to the capital city, and they have the king trapped in his city. And just as they're about to take the city, the king offers his heir to the throne as a sacrifice on the city wall. The text immediately says there was great fury against Israel, and using the same verbs used to describe Sennacherib's retreat, says that Israel got up and left. Now, the phrase great fury here, when it's used in historical narratives, only ever refers to divine fury. So it was a deity who caused Israel's retreat from Moab. What deity could that have been? The plain sense of the text is that this human sacrifice successfully catalyzed the intervention of the Moabite patron deity Chemosh. There's no rational case to make that Adonai, the God of Israel, became angry with Israel and drove them out of Moab because the king of Moab sacrificed his heir to the throne. Now, when this coalition mounted this invasion, there was a prophet who had a prophecy from the God of Israel saying, I will deliver Moab into your hands. That failed. That simply did not happen. There is no case to make.
This is not true, but we're going to let him speak.
That Moab was delivered into their hands. So this story is directly parallel to what happened with Sennacherib and Hezekiah. Remember who you think won that battle. Now tell me who won the battle between Moab and Israel. According to the concept of divine warfare in ancient Southwest Asia, your battles were not really your own work. They were the work of your patron deities. And so the battle here is not between the coalition of Edom, Israel, and Judah and the Moabites. The battle is between the Moabite patron deity Chemosh and the God of Israel, Adonai. And in this story, the God of Israel loses. The author's clearly not happy about that, and they're clearly trying to be as succinct and as unclear as possible. But there's only one rational way to read this story, and that is that the God of Israel lost in battle to the patron deity of another nation.
There's only one rational way. No, I disagree with that. There's actually, the only rational way to read it is if you're being guided by the Spirit and you have a consistent hermeneutic. But if you are not being guided by the Spirit, if you have a bias because you don't believe in God and therefore you're trying to pick holes in God's word and take things out of context to twist them for an agenda, regardless of how educated you are, it's useless. The world's wisdom is foolishness to God. If you do not believe the first line of Genesis, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, how can you possibly understand anything that comes after that? That's a gate. If you don't pass through the gate, you're just going to sit outside looking in and say, oh, well, this is probably that. This is probably that. You're not going to have an understanding of what's going on. This is exactly what's happening. And a lot of people believe the words of these types. They go for the world's wisdom, and they don't investigate for themselves. Instead of, remember, you come to the challenge, and what do you do at that challenge? Do you go the way of the fall and you cast down on God's character, God's sovereignty, and you listen to people like this? Or do you say, that sounds really interesting. It contradicts everything I've ever learned about God and in the Bible and in history, God's sovereignty, God's goodness. So there must be an opportunity to learn something here deeper about the Bible and about how to interpret the Bible. If you go that route, then you'll find that there are answers that are very reasonable to the situation. Of course, these things are sometimes hidden in context or lost in translation. And as a result, people like this will take advantage of your mind. So don't let them take advantage of your mind. We're going to read a commentary so that you can get a little edified on this issue. This is from North Heights, Church of Christ, coc.org. Did God lose in 2 Kings chapter 3? And there are many such articles on this. You can look them up for yourself. There's many good apologetics on this, so that you're well armed against people who say, see, Yahweh was just a tribal deity, and we even have proof that he lost to another tribal deity, so he must not be, the real God. Well, think again. Let's talk about 2 Kings 3 and the implication some people get out of it, which is that God lost a battle. Is that possible? That doesn't sound like God. He's a winner. He's a champion. He's undefeated, isn't he? Does the text say God lost a battle? First, let's summarize 2 Kings 3. The whole chapter is important to this topic, so I'd encourage you to read it on your own. But to summarize it, we see the following. We're in the days of the divided kingdom. Jehoram rules over Israel, and Jehoshaphat rules over Judah. The Moabites have attacked Israel, 2 Kings chapter 3, and King Jehoram asked Jehoshaphat, the king of Edom, to help him defeat Moab. In the midst of their campaign, the armies face a water shortage, so they asked the prophet Elisha to help. In response, Elisha miraculously provides water to them, 2 Kings 3 verse 20, and assures them that God will deliver Moabites to them. That's in verse 18. So far, this is pretty typical, and it continues to be typical as the combined Israel-Judah-Edomite forces invade and defeat the Moabites with ease in verses 24 to 25. But when we come to the last two verses of the chapter, which say this, quote, "And when the king of Moab saw that the battle was too sore for him, he took with him 700 men that drew swords to break through even unto the king of Edom, but they could not. Then he took his eldest son that should have reigned in his stead, and offered him for a burnt offering on the wall. And there was a great indignation against Israel, and they departed from him and returned to their own land." And this is, again, if you take this out of context, it seems like, well, gosh, I guess they made an offering, and that empowered the enemy god to be even stronger than Yahweh. What's going on? That's not what happened. The phrase in the King James is, quote, "There was great indignation against Israel." Other translations read it as great fury or great wrath or great anger. They all mean the same thing. It's what happened next that's the head scratcher. Israel left. The army that had driven into the heart of Moab and had pinned in the Moabite king with nowhere to run turned and left without finishing the job. They all turned to their own lands, and that was that. That's the end of the account. The next chapter moves on to a different event entirely. So, what gives? It sounds like what happened was the Moabite king offered his son as a human sacrifice to his pagan god. After that, the fight against Israel turned against Israel, and they retreated. Israel was fighting with God, and Elisha promised they would win, but they didn't. Did Moab's God just defeat Israel's God? It's got a little gif here from The Office. What's going on? Yeah, what is going on? Don't let them get into your mind. Let's everybody just calm down for a second. No, that's not what happened. Moab's God did not just one-shot the Lord God Almighty. The answer to this challenge, which Bible critics will happily raise as proof that God is not all-powerful. Again, what's the forbidden fruit? God's not sovereign. You can't trust God's character, and you can't trust God's word. It's found in the details. First, Elisha did not say that the army of Israel, Judah, or Edom would defeat the Moabite king. He said that they would defeat the Moabites and defeat their cities. See verse 18 through 19. And that's exactly what happened. Unfortunately, the way the text is written leaves out a lot of the little details about what happened in the end. But there are a few things worth remembering. First, this was a fight between Moab and Israel, the northern kingdom, and Israel, the north, was not in good standing with God. A point which Elisha reminds Jehoram almost as soon as they meet. This is an important point, folks. And again, if you read things out of context, which all of these people do, all of the things I'm presenting to you in this presentation, from the pagan stuff, we're going to look at the next section is going to be the occult, then Satan, all these people who make these wild arguments, guaranteed, without even thinking about it, guaranteed they're taking something out of context. And they go the wrong way when they reach a challenge in Scripture, and they cast doubt on God's character, God's word, God's sovereignty. Moving on, Elisha basically says, if it wasn't for Jehoshaphat, I wouldn't even be talking to you right now. That's verse 13 through 14. Second, once the invasion is underway, just before the big final push against the Moabite king, we stop reading about those three nations and those three kings, the kings of Israel, Judah, and Edom. And instead, the writer just talks about Israel. The three kings invaded and had great success. The next thing we read, however, is that the Moabites charging for the Israel camp, thinking they had a numbers advantage. After that, the Israel army rose up and fought them, verse 24. We do get a mention of the Moabite king trying and failing to defeat Edom. That's in verse 26. But again, there's no mention of Judah. The one nation of the three in good standing with God isn't mentioned in the latter part of the text. Might that help us understand why Israel, quote unquote, left without finishing the job versus Moab? Maybe. Personally, I think the answer is explained by what happened at the end of the chapter. The Moabite king murdered his son in a last-ditch effort to preserve his kingdom. I think it's possible that, in response to that, the temporary alliance dissolved. I think Judah, being opposed to human sacrifice, would have decided it wasn't worth continuing the fight anymore. It's worth noting that the text does not say the army was defeated, only that they withdrew and departed. Also keep in mind that this was never supposed to be an invasion with the intent to conquer Moab. Rather, it was a forceful quelling of an attack by Moab against Israel. That's also an important point. It wasn't like they were invading Moab to go and annex them into, their kingdoms. Moab was attacking Israel, northern Israel. Northern Israel solicited an alliance between Judah and Edom and Israel, northern Israel. And so they're just acting in self-defense. They're not going to go and take over the territory. So that's an important point. They didn't need to kill the Moabite king or conquer the entire Moabite kingdom to win, quote unquote. They had already won by toppling the cities left and right in the route to the Moabite capital. In short, the arguments that this text proves that God lost the battle are spurious at best. All the text says is that Israel, a nation in no good standing with God, was allowed by the Lord to push back a rival that had attacked them, and then, when they came to the precipice of killing the rival ruler, they turned back. Maybe they were turned back by God's providence. It wouldn't be the first time God stepped in to directly decide who rules over a kingdom. Nothing about this text is out of harmony with the rest of the Bible, and nothing about it implies that God is not in control or that he lost this battle or any other. True, which again, if he killed 185,000 Assyrian soldiers with a snap of his finger, this is not even close to an issue. Nothing would be an issue. Nothing is impossible for God. So how do we respond to this? Well, we respond very clearly. First off, what this person is saying, which is very astute, is that you had an alliance, okay? Let's go point by point. First point is they're not going, and Israel is not the agitators here. They're not the ones going to invade Moab. They're on the defensive. They're being invaded. They solicit an alliance between Edom and Judah and them, and they go and push these guys back. On the way to the capital, they're destroying their cities left and right, which proved that, okay, like you failed to invade us, and Elisha's prophecy was true, that yes, the Moabites will be given into their hand. It doesn't say you will rule over Moab. The Moabites will be given into your hand. What does that mean? Well, the Moabites are invading you, and they're going to be given into your hand. You're going to squelch their invasion. That's basically exactly what happened. That's number one. Number two, the next thing that the text does is that it doesn't continue talking about the alliance of these three kingdoms, Judah, northern Israel, and what was the third one? Edomites. It doesn't continue talking about the alliance. It just says Israel. So, very likely what happened, again, there's certain details that we don't have, but this is the test, folks. This is the test. And the test is, do you read the Bible in the context of the Bible? Right? Again, we know that God's word is true. We know that Jesus upheld the Old Testament as true and legitimate and continuous. We know that Jesus is Yahweh. So do the math. Ultimately, this is just one of those situations where you don't have all the details. For example, here's another example. In Chronicles and Kings, where you have the two parallel accounts of Yahweh incited David versus Satan incited David to number the sons of Israel. Okay, well, that's all you get. What does that mean? Is it an error in the Bible? Is Yahweh Satan? All these types of crazy comments that people make because they don't take things in context. What does that mean? Well, you don't have a lot of details in what happens in those passages. You don't have a lot of details, but you have enough in the Bible. You have the book of Job that tells you exactly how Yahweh, who claims he's the sovereign God, doesn't change, self-existent one, has always been around. That means the things that he does, they're precedents, and you can always count on them in other places maybe where you don't have that much information. Do you see how it's about trust? If you read the book of Job and you understand the interaction between Satan and Yahweh and how Satan has to ask Yahweh for permission to do anything, you can go from that rich narrative and go into other places that are not so detailed, like David being incited to number the sons of Israel so that Israel could be judged and Yahweh could show his mercy, which is a whole interesting discussion as well. But nevertheless, the point is that the Bible there doesn't really tell you much. It just tells you one line. And in another parallel account, it tells you Yahweh incited David. Well, obviously we know from James that God doesn't tempt anybody. So what happened? Well, you put one and one together. You know how the interaction with Job happened. So very likely what happened was Satan was accusing Israel of idolatry in front of God, saying, why don't you punish them, God? You're just holding out because David's, your man on the throne. So let me test him. Let me prove to you that, he's just going to fall to temptation. Probably something like that. It doesn't take a stretch of the imagination because God is consistent and the devil is predictable. So they have an interaction that you can understand by one frame of reference, which of course is Job. Same thing with the New Testament, where Satan begs Jesus to have Peter to try him and to sift him like wheat. Same interaction. Satan is asking for permission from God to test Peter, which, by the way, that's a proof of Jesus' divinity also, because why would Satan ask Jesus if Jesus wasn't God? Do you get the point? So this is the way that we interpret the Bible. We use the Bible to interpret the Bible. So now back to the situation. Israel was just defending itself. It wasn't going to conquer Moab. So yes, the prophecy was fulfilled because the Moabites were given into their hand. The Moabites lost. The Moabites' intention was to take over Israel. They were given into Israel's hand. They lost. Losing is not being defined as your kingdom is now annexed into Israel, which is what the Dan McClellan is trying to claim. Well, see, they didn't really take over Moab all the way, so the prophecy wasn't fulfilled. Well, no, you're mixing two things up, which, of course, if you have a bias, then that's what you do. There's that. There's the fact that Israel wasn't in good favor with God, so why should God give them, even more victory beyond just being able to squelch the invasion? There's that. There's the fact that God determines who rules and when, even the wicked. I mean, here's another example, folks. Look at Bible prophecy with the beast, okay? The beast has been allowed by God to exist. It almost got conquered by Islam when the Crusades happened and all these things, and Islam started pushing into Europe as judgment against the beast. I talk about this in my Trumpets episode of my End Time series. And yes, God was using the Muslims to judge the papacy. That is one of the trumpets that happened. Just like he used like Attila the Hun to judge the Romans, like the Persians to judge the Babylonians, like the Greeks to judge the Persians, and so on and so forth. God determines the appointed time for peoples and kings and rulers. Israel was not in favor with God. This was okay, fine, we'll just give you some protection so you don't get eliminated. So the question is, well, why didn't Israel take out Moab all the way? Well, who knows what happened exactly, but very likely, after that human sacrifice happened, Judah okay, we don't want to deal with this anymore. Who knows? They're probably going to sacrifice even more people if we keep pushing. We're done. The Bible doesn't tell you anything about the alliance. It just says Israel went. So we don't know what happened with Judah and with Edom. Edomites, whatever. Edomites weren't, in a covenant relationship with God. So it's not very clear. But we know for sure that Israel didn't have favor with God. So they were just given enough to basically be defended. Just like when Sennacherib was attacking Israel, he was allowed to, this is something that the Dan McClellan doesn't bring up. When Sennacherib was attacking Israel, and this is funny because we have a stele that Sennacherib engraved that he took out all these towns, but they ignore the fact that they lost in Jerusalem. There's a whole thing on Expedition Bible on YouTube where they talk about Sennacherib's stele, the stone that he engraves all these military conquests. And of course, Sennacherib was allowed to punish Israel and to judge them by taking many of their cities, but not Jerusalem. When he came to Jerusalem, okay, that's it. That's the boundary that God has determined that Sennacherib won't cross. And once you're there, okay, it's time for you to go home. Same thing with this situation. If you're going to equate the two situations, then equate them the way they're supposed to be equated. You see, he's trying to equate them and say, well, see, therefore, a false conclusion. No, the conclusion is that God is sovereign, and just like he determined that Sennacherib won't cross the line into Jerusalem, kill 185,000 Assyrians, see you later, buddy. The same way he determined that apostate Israel, who was out of favor with God, is not going to take over Moab all the way. Moab still has a purpose as an evil, rebellious villain in the story for a little bit later. Of course, Moab eventually gets taken out, but the point is that God had drawn a line, just like he drew a line with Jerusalem. Do you see the equivalence, the true equivalence, not the false equivalence? The false equivalence is, because as the Assyrians retreated, therefore Israel retreating means that God lost a battle. No, that doesn't follow whatsoever. The true equivalence is Sennacherib retreated because God is sovereign and determines the appointed times for people to rule and to exist in various places. In the same way that Israel retreated, who was out of favor with God, by the way, and God had said, enough. They still have some time to be on the earth. Just like the beast. The Islam almost took over Europe, and then they got pushed back. God said, nope, the beast needs to be around until the end. That's what I have determined. That's God's decision. So God is the one that's sovereign. God is the one that determines the appointed time for kings and empires and kingdoms. And ultimately, if we use the Bible to interpret the Bible, then we can find the truth. So do not let people like this with clever arguments cloud your judgment and cast doubt and sow the seeds of despair in your mind, because these things are easily refuted if we actually read the Bible in context, number one, and if we trust that God is good, that he's sovereign, and that his word is true. If you trust, you don't have to be a Bible scholar to find the truth. You just have to trust. When you're exposed to these things, which on face value, I can see how serious of a challenge this is. Because if you don't read this in context, and if you aren't prepared to deal with it, it's like, oh my gosh, like, is there something that I have missed in the Bible? Have I been lied to? Especially in this day and age when we're so used to learning that everything has been a lie, right? So this is very sensitive situations, but again, read in context and you'll be sure to find the truth. Now, onward for real to part 6, is Yahweh an occult name?